The Ashford Museum of Natural History had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Director Margaret Chen stood in the climate-controlled vault, watching as the courier carefully extracted a velvet-lined case from his reinforced briefcase. The overhead lights caught the contents, and even through the protective glass, the diamond blazed with an inner fire that made her breath catch. "The Star of Kinshasa," she whispered. Though she'd seen hundreds of photographs, nothing compared to the reality. The stone weighed 42 carats, cut in a modified brilliant style that maximized its natural clarity. According to the provenance documents, it had been discovered in the Democratic Republic of Congo 18 months earlier, passed through 3 verified dealers, and authenticated by 2 independent gemological laboratories in Antwerp and New York. The museum had paid $4.7 million for it, funded by a generous donation from the Pemberton Foundation specifically for expanding their minerals and gems collection. Margaret's assistant curator, David Okosh, leaned closer to the case. "The clarity is remarkable," he said. "I've never seen a stone this size without any visible inclusions." The courier, a serious man named Heinrich, who'd flown from Belgium specifically for this delivery, allowed himself a small smile. "It is graded as internally flawless. Only 1 in 500,000 diamonds achieves this classification at such a size. The Ashford should be very proud of this acquisition." Over the next hour, they completed the formal transfer. Margaret signed documents, verified serial numbers, and watched as their own security team took custody of the stone. It would be displayed in the Grand Hall starting next month, the centerpiece of an exhibition called Treasures from the Earth, a journey through geological time. That evening, Margaret invited Dr. Sarah Winters to a private viewing. Sarah served as the museum's consulting gemologist, a role she balanced with her teaching position at the university. She arrived after closing hours, her examination kit in hand, ready to conduct the preliminary assessment that would inform the exhibition materials. "I've been looking forward to this all week," Sarah admitted as they descended to the vault. "A natural diamond of this caliber is extraordinarily rare." In the examination room adjacent to the vault, Sarah set up her equipment with practiced efficiency. She had a stereoscopic microscope, a spectroscope, a refractometer, and several other instruments that would help her document the diamond's characteristics. Margaret watched as Sarah first examined the stone with a standard jeweler's loupe, noting the precision of the cut, the symmetry of the facets. "The craftsmanship is exceptional," Sarah murmured. "Each facet is perfectly aligned. The angles are textbook brilliant cut, optimized for maximum light return." She placed the diamond under the microscope, adjusting the illumination. For several minutes, she worked in silence, rotating the stone slowly, examining it from every angle. Margaret waited, accustomed to the patience required for scientific observation. "I'm not seeing any inclusions at this magnification," Sarah said. "That's consistent with the IF grading. Let me check the girdle for the laser inscription." She rotated the diamond to examine its edge, where gemological laboratories typically inscribed their certification numbers using microscopic laser etching. The numbers were there, matching the certification documents perfectly. Next came the spectroscope, which would analyze how the diamond interacted with light across different wavelengths. Sarah positioned the stone carefully, adjusted the instrument, and peered through the eyepiece. She was quiet for a long moment. "Interesting," she said softly. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "The absorption spectrum." Sarah made a note in her tablet. "It's showing the characteristic pattern for type 2A diamond. That's actually quite special. Only about 2% of natural diamonds fall into this classification. They have virtually no nitrogen impurities, which gives them exceptional transparency." "Is that consistent with the origin story, the Congo mine?" Margaret asked. "Type 2A diamonds can come from anywhere," Sarah replied, "though they are found in certain African deposits. It's not inconsistent with the provenance, just notable." She paused, then added, "I'd like to run some additional tests tomorrow, if that's acceptable. More detailed spectroscopy, some measurements with the refractometer, just for completeness." "Of course," Margaret agreed. "We want the exhibition materials to be thorough." Sarah packed her equipment slowly, her movements methodical. Margaret had worked with her long enough to recognize when something was occupying the gemologist's thoughts. "Is there a concern?" she asked. Sarah looked up, seeming to consider her words carefully. "Not a concern, exactly, just curiosity. The stone is remarkable, almost too perfect, if such a thing exists in nature." She smiled, perhaps to soften the observation. "But that's what makes it museum-worthy, isn't it? The exceptional examples." They returned the diamond to its vault, secured behind multiple layers of protection. As they walked to the museum's rear exit, Margaret felt a small seed of unease that she couldn't quite identify. She pushed it aside. The diamond had been certified by two of the most respected laboratories in the world. The provenance was documented and verified. The Pemberton Foundation's due diligence had been extensive. Still, as she drove home through the quiet streets, she found herself thinking about Sarah's words. Almost too perfect. In her 15 years as museum director, Margaret had learned to trust the instincts of experts. Scientists spend their careers developing an intuition for their subjects, a sense of when something was right or subtly wrong. She would ask Sarah to be thorough in her additional testing, very thorough. The Star of Kinshasa rested in its vault, catching and refracting the faint glow of security lights, its facets throwing tiny rainbows across the steel walls. In 6 weeks, thousands of visitors would marvel at its beauty. But first, it would need to survive scrutiny from one of the most meticulous gemologists in the field. The investigation, though no one called it that yet, had quietly begun. Sarah Winters returned to the museum at 8 the following morning, earlier than she'd told Margaret she would arrive. She'd spent a restless night thinking about the diamond, about the perfect clarity and the spectroscopic readings that were technically correct, but somehow felt rehearsed, like a student reciting memorized answers rather than understanding. The museum's senior security guard, Thomas, let her into the vault level. They'd worked together for years, and he knew her irregular schedule. "Starting early, Dr. Winters?" Couldn't sleep, she admitted. Occupational hazard when you have a 42-carat question mark waiting for you. In the examination room, she set up her equipment more extensively than the previous evening. Today, she'd brought her Raman spectrometer from the university lab, a piece of equipment that could identify materials by analyzing how they scattered laser light. It was more sensitive than standard gemological instruments and could detect subtle variations in crystal structure. She also had her polariscope, her thermal probe, and a high-resolution camera equipped with specialized filters. If there was anything unusual about this diamond, she intended to find it. The stone sat in its mounting under the microscope, magnificent and inscrutable. Sarah began with the refractometer, measuring how light bent as it passed through the diamond. She took readings from multiple angles, recording each measurement with precision. The refractive index came back at 2.417, exactly what one would expect for diamond. But as she took measurements from different facets, she noticed something that made her pause. The readings were almost identical across all angles, not similar, identical to the third decimal place. Natural diamonds, even those of exceptional quality, showed tiny variations in their refractive index depending on the crystal direction. Diamond has a cubic crystal structure, but natural formation processes create microscopic irregularities. These variations were typically minute, often undetectable without precise instruments, but they were there. This stone showed no such variation. Its refractive index was uniform to a degree she'd never encountered in a natural diamond. Sarah made careful notes and then moved to the Raman spectrometer. This test would reveal the diamond's crystal structure at a molecular level. By examining how the carbon atoms were bonded, she calibrated the instrument, positioned the laser, and initiated the scan. The resulting spectrum appeared on her laptop screen. There it was, the characteristic sharp peak at 1,332 wave numbers that confirmed crystalline diamond. But as she examined the spectral line more closely, she noticed it was remarkably narrow. The peak width, measured at half maximum, was smaller than she'd seen in natural diamonds. In natural diamond formation, which occurred deep in the Earth's mantle under intense pressure and temperature over billions of years, the crystal structure developed irregularities. These irregularities caused the Raman peak to broaden slightly. Synthetic diamonds, grown in controlled laboratory conditions, often produced narrower peaks because their formation environment was more consistent. Sarah sat back troubled. Individually, each observation could be explained. Collectively, they suggested a pattern. She picked up her thermal probe, a device that measured heat conductivity. Diamond is the most thermally conductive natural material, which is why jewelers sometimes use thermal testing to distinguish it from simulants like cubic zirconia. She touched the probe to the stone's table facet and watched the reading stabilize. The thermal conductivity was high, consistent with diamond, but again the reading was at the very top of the expected range, showing the kind of uniformity that came from controlled growth rather than natural formation. By noon, Sarah had conducted 7 different tests. Each one confirmed The stone was indeed diamond. There was no question about that. The carbon atoms were arranged in the correct crystalline structure. The physical properties matched diamond specifications, but the uniformity of those properties was troubling. She was photographing the stone under cross-polarized light when she found the first definitive clue. Under normal lighting, the diamond appeared flawless. Under polarized light, which revealed internal strain patterns in the crystal structure, natural diamonds typically showed irregular patterns, fingerprints of their chaotic formation. Synthetic diamonds often showed different patterns, geometric and more regular, reflecting the controlled environment in which they grew. Sarah sat back motionless, staring at her notes. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. No single test was definitive, but the pattern was clear to someone who'd spent 20 years studying diamonds. The star of Kinshasa might not be from Kinshasa at all. It might be from a laboratory in Russia or China, or perhaps even the United States, where several facilities had perfected the art of growing large, flawless diamonds. She needed to be certain before she said anything to Margaret. An accusation of forgery was serious, potentially devastating for the museum's reputation. But she also needed to document her findings while the stone was still available for testing. She called Margaret, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I'd like to conduct some additional tests this afternoon. There are some interesting characteristics I want to document for the exhibition materials." "Interesting good or interesting concerning?" Margaret asked, picking up on the undertone. "Interesting thorough. I want to be absolutely complete in my analysis. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Sarah returned to the microscope, examining the diamond with fresh suspicion. If this was a synthetic stone, it was a masterpiece of laboratory creation. The size, the clarity, the color, all were extraordinary. Someone had grown or commissioned a diamond specifically to fool expert examination. The question was, who had done it, and at what point in the chain of custody had the substitution occurred? She thought about the provenance documents, the certifications from Antwerp and New York. Had those laboratories been fooled, or were they complicit? The implications were staggering. Under the microscope, the star of Kinshasa glittered innocently, keeping its secrets locked in the precise geometry of its artificial perfection. Margaret arrived at the museum with two people Sarah hadn't expected. One was James Pemberton himself, the elderly philanthropist whose foundation had funded the diamond purchase. The other was a woman in her 50s wearing a practical gray suit and carrying a slim briefcase. "Dr. Winters," Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled concern. "I've asked James to join us, given the Foundation's investment in the acquisition. And this is Detective Linda Vasquez from the Art Fraud Division of the Metropolitan Police. She's an old friend, and I thought it prudent to have her here for what you need to tell us." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This had moved from scientific curiosity to potential criminal investigation with startling speed. She'd known Margaret would take her concern seriously, but involving law enforcement this quickly showed how much the director trusted her assessment. They gathered around the examination table where the diamond rested under the microscope. Sarah had prepared a summary of her findings, complete with photographs and spectroscopic data. "Before we begin," Detective Vasquez said, "I want to understand the stakes. Dr. Winters, you're suggesting this diamond is not what it purports to be. I'm suggesting it may be laboratory-grown rather than naturally mined, which would mean it's still a diamond, chemically and structurally, but its origin, and therefore its value, would be completely different." James Pemberton leaned heavily on his cane. At 83, he'd made his fortune in technology and spent his later years supporting cultural institutions. The difference being, the naturally mined diamond of this quality would be worth the $4.7 million the museum paid. A laboratory-grown diamond of the same size and quality might be worth $50,000 to $100,000, maybe less, depending on production costs. The number hung in the air. Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened on the cane handle. "Walk us through your evidence," Vasquez said, pulling out a notebook. Sarah took them through each test methodically. She showed them the uniformity in the refractive index readings, explaining why natural diamonds should show variation. She displayed the Raman spectroscopy results, pointing out the unusually narrow peak. She demonstrated the strain pattern visible under polarized light. Each piece of evidence is subtle, but together they suggest synthetic origin, specifically HPHT synthesis, high pressure, high temperature, which is one of the two primary methods for growing diamonds in laboratories. Margaret studied the polarized light photographs. Could these patterns occur in natural diamonds? Theoretically, yes, Sarah admitted, but the probability of all these characteristics appearing together in a natural diamond is extremely low. In 20 years, I've never seen it. "But you're not certain," Pemberton said quietly. "Not absolutely certain, no, not yet." Sarah pulled up another image on her laptop. "There's one more test I'd like to conduct, but it requires sending a tiny sample to a specialized laboratory. It's called secondary ion mass spectrometry, or SIMS analysis. It measures the nitrogen isotope ratios in the diamond." "Explain," Vasquez said. "Natural diamonds form deep in the Earth's mantle, where nitrogen isotope ratios have specific values determined by geological processes. Laboratory-grown diamonds use nitrogen from Earth's atmosphere as a starting material, which has slightly different isotope ratios. SIMS can detect that difference definitively." "How small a sample?" Margaret asked. "A few micrograms. We'd use a focused ion beam to extract material from an inconspicuous location. The damage would be microscopic, invisible to the naked eye." Vasquez made notes. "How long for results?" "The laboratory I have in mind is at MIT. They could turn it around in 3 to 4 days if I explain the urgency." Pemberton nodded slowly. "Do it. I'd rather know the truth than preserve a beautiful lie." The conversation shifted to logistics and implications. If the diamond proved synthetic, the museum would need to contact the dealer, trace the provenance backwards, involve international authorities. The certifications from Antwerp and New York would need to be investigated. Someone along the chain had either been fooled or was complicit in fraud. "There's another possibility," Vasquez said. "The substitution might have occurred after certification. Someone could have replaced the certified natural diamond with a synthetic that matched its specifications. That would require extraordinary skill, Sarah said. Growing or obtaining a synthetic diamond that matched the size, cut, and color grade of the original would be challenging. But possible. Yes, possible. They discussed security footage, insurance protocols, the sealed courier chain from Belgium. Vasquez would review all of it. But her expression suggested she'd seen enough art fraud cases to know that determined criminals found ways around even sophisticated security. Before they left the examination room, Sarah carefully extracted the tiny sample she needed. She used a diamond-tipped microdrill to remove material from the girdle, the diamond's edge where the pavilion and crown met. The sample location would be hidden by the mounting when the stone was displayed. The material went into a specialized container which she sealed and labeled. Tomorrow, she'd courier it personally to MIT. As they prepared to lock the vault, Pemberton paused. "Dr. Winters, if this proves to be synthetic, does that make it less beautiful?" Sarah considered the question. No, the beauty is in the structure, the way it interacts with light. That doesn't change based on origin, but the rarity does. Natural diamonds are rare because nature rarely produces them. Synthetic diamonds can be made on demand. Rarity creates value. So we paid $4.7 million for something beautiful that isn't rare. That's the fraud. Not the thing itself, but the scarcity we believed we were buying. Exactly. In the parking garage, after the others had left, Vasquez approached Sarah. "Off the record, what's your confidence level that this is synthetic?" Sarah thought about the strain patterns, the spectroscopic readings, the too perfect uniformity. 90%, maybe 95%, but I've been wrong before. Let's hope you're wrong now, because if you're right, this is going to get very complicated very quickly. Sarah drove home with the sample container secured in her bag, feeling the weight of what she might have discovered. Somewhere in the world, someone had created or commissioned a perfect fraud. Now it was her job to prove it, and Detective Vasquez's job to find who was responsible. The Star of Kinshasa waited in its vault, its secrets encoded in isotope ratios and crystal strain patterns, silent witness to its own deception. 4 days later, Sarah sat in her university office staring at the email from MIT. She'd read it 3 times, checking the data attachments, verifying the signature, making absolutely certain before she picked up the phone. The Sims analysis was unambiguous. The nitrogen isotope ratio in the diamond sample showed delta 15N values of -5.2 per mil, characteristic of atmospheric nitrogen. Natural diamonds from the Earth's mantle typically showed values between -15 and -40 per mil, reflecting the deep geological reservoir from which their nitrogen originated. The Star of Kinshasa was synthetic, definitively, incontrovertibly synthetic. Sarah called Margaret first, then Detective Vasquez. Within 2 hours, they reconvened in the museum's vault level, this time with 2 additional people, an investigator from the Pemberton Foundation's legal team and an agent from Interpol's Stolen Art and Antiquities Division. The Interpol agent, Marcus Beaumont, was particularly interested in the technical details. He'd investigated numerous cases of art fraud, but fewer involving gemstones. The sophistication required to produce this stone, he said, studying Sarah's report, narrows our suspect pool considerably. How many facilities worldwide could create a 42-carat diamond of this quality? Perhaps 20 or 30. The technology for growing large HPHT diamonds is well established, but producing them at this size with this clarity requires significant expertise and equipment. The major facilities are in Russia, China, the United States, and Singapore. Could you identify which facility produced it? Sarah considered. Possibly. Different laboratories use slightly different growth conditions, which can leave trace chemical signatures. I'd need to do more detailed analysis, look at impurity patterns, growth sector boundaries, perhaps some isotopic work on carbon rather than nitrogen. It's time-consuming, but potentially feasible. Vasquez spread out her investigation results. I've reviewed the provenance documentation. The diamond supposedly came from the Chicapa region of the DRC, was purchased by a dealer named Rousseau in Kinshasa, sold to an intermediary dealer in Antwerp named Van Decker, and then authenticated and sold through Hastings Fine Gems in New York. I've contacted all parties. And, Margaret asked, I've reviewed the provenance documentation. The diamond supposedly came from the Chicapa region of the DRC, was purchased by a dealer named Rousseau in Kinshasa, sold to an intermediary dealer in Antwerp named Van Decker, and then authenticated and sold through Hastings Fine Gems in New York. I've contacted all parties. And, Margaret asked, Rousseau exists but claims he never handled this particular stone. The documentation bearing his signature appears to be forged. He's sending comparison samples of his actual signature. Van Decker in Antwerp is more interesting. The company exists, the dealer is legitimate, but when I contacted him about this specific transaction, he became evasive. How evasive? Beaumont leaned forward. He confirmed he'd handled a diamond matching this description, but said all his documentation was in order. He referred me to his lawyers. The certification from the Antwerp laboratory is legitimate. They did examine a diamond and issue that report. The question is whether the diamond they examined is the same one that arrived here. A substitution, Margaret said. That's my working theory, Vasquez confirmed. Someone inserted a synthetic diamond into the chain, probably in Antwerp after the legitimate certification. Van Decker either made the switch himself or unwittingly passed along the substitution. Sarah had been studying the certification documents during this exchange. The New York certification was performed by Hastings Lab, which is part of Hastings Fine Gems. They both authenticated and sold the stone. That's unusual. Most dealers use independent laboratories. I noticed that too, Vasquez said. I have an appointment with Gerald Hastings tomorrow. He's agreed to cooperate with the investigation, but I suspect he's more victim than perpetrator. If the switch happened in Antwerp, the synthetic stone would have arrived with seemingly legitimate prior certification. Hastings would have had no reason to question it. The Pemberton Foundation's investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Torres, had been reviewing financial records. The payment went through standard channels, wire transfer to Hastings Fine Gems, cleared through their business account. If Hastings was running a fraud, he'd have to split the proceeds with whoever supplied the synthetic diamond. I've subpoenaed his financial records. Over the next hour, they developed a strategy. Sarah would conduct additional analysis to try to identify the manufacturing facility. Vasquez and Beaumont would continue tracing the provenance, focusing on Van Decker and Antwerp. Torres would follow the money. Margaret would handle communications. The museum needed to prepare for the possibility that this would become public. What about other diamonds? Pemberton asked. He'd been quiet through most of the meeting, processing the confirmation of his foundation's loss. If someone is substituting synthetic stones into the legitimate market, this might not be an isolated incident. It was a sobering thought. Sarah knew that several major museums and collectors had purchased significant diamonds in recent years. She can reach out to colleagues, discreetly suggest that institutions verify their acquisitions, but we should be careful not to trigger panic in the market. "I'll coordinate with other law enforcement agencies," Beaumont said. "If this is part of a larger operation, we need to identify the scope." Before they adjourned, Sarah returned to the vault for one final examination. Now that she knew the diamond was synthetic, she found herself looking at it differently. The perfection that had first troubled her now seemed obvious. No natural process could produce such uniformity. This diamond hadn't formed over billions of years in the Earth's mantle. It had been grown over weeks or months in a controlled chamber, probably in a facility that produced dozens like it. She thought about the criminal who'd conceived this fraud. They'd needed geomological expertise to understand what tests the diamond would face. They'd needed connections to the legitimate diamond trade to insert the forgery into the supply chain. They'd needed access to sophisticated laboratory equipment to produce the stone. And they'd needed audacity to think they could fool experts. In a way, they nearly had. If the diamond had been slightly less perfect, if Sarah had been slightly less thorough, it might have hung in the museum's exhibition for years, viewed by thousands of visitors who would never know they were looking at a manufactured crystal rather than a geological miracle. Under the examination lights, the synthetic diamond blazed with cold fire. It was still beautiful, still technically impressive, but it represented a crime that cost nearly $5 million and betrayed the trust that underpinned the entire rare gems market. Sarah packaged her samples for the additional analysis. Somewhere in the trace impurities and growth patterns, the diamond would tell her where it was born, and that knowledge would lead them to who was responsible. The investigation was accelerating now, moving from discovery to pursuit. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While Sarah worked on identifying the synthetic diamonds manufacturing facility, and Vasquez investigated the Antwerp connection, Catherine Torres found the critical link in financial records. Not in Hastings Fine Gems accounts, which proved clean, but in a pattern of smaller transactions connected to Van Decker's business in Antwerp. Torres presented her findings in Margaret's office, spreading printouts across the conference table. Van Decker received 3 payments over the past year from a consulting firm called Mineral Clarity Solutions, based in Singapore. The amounts were modest, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, characterized as authentication services. Singapore, Sarah said immediately. That's where one of the major HPTT synthesis facilities operates, Premier Diamond Technologies. Exactly, Torres said. I couldn't get access to Mineral Clarity's complete financial records without international warrants, but I did some background research. The company was registered 2 years ago by a Dr. Chen Wei, who happens to have a PhD in material science from MIT and previously worked at Premier Diamond Technologies. Vasquez was already on her phone, coordinating with Beaumont. Within hours, they had confirmation. Dr. Chen Wei had left Premier Diamond Technologies 18 months ago under circumstances the company wouldn't discuss. He'd taken with him extensive knowledge of their HPTT synthesis processes and likely samples or specifications of the diamonds they could produce. The investigation accelerated rapidly. Interpol obtained warrants for Chen's business records in Singapore. What they found was meticulous documentation of a sophisticated fraud operation. Chen had been producing or acquiring synthetic diamonds from Premier's facility, whether through legitimate means or industrial espionage was still unclear, and inserting them into the supply chain through carefully cultivated relationships with dealers like Van Decker. The operation had been running for at least a year, possibly longer. The Star of Kinshasa wasn't Chen's only fraud. Interpol identified at least 7 other suspicious transactions involving high-value diamonds that had passed through Van Decker's business after receiving authentication services from Mineral Clarity Solutions. Detective Vasquez flew to Antwerp with Beaumont to interview Van Decker personally. When confronted with the evidence, the dealer broke quickly. He'd been struggling financially, his business pressured by changing market conditions and increased competition. Chen had approached him with a proposal. Van Decker would accept high-quality synthetic diamonds with forged provenance documentation, pass them through his legitimate business to provide credibility, and share in the profits. He convinced me the stones would never be detected, Van Decker said in his recorded statement. He said modern synthetics were indistinguishable from natural diamonds, that the only reason they sold for less was market perception, not any actual difference in quality. "But you knew you were committing fraud," Vasquez said. "I knew I was selling synthetic diamonds as natural ones, yes. But Chen said it wasn't really fraud because the stones were chemically identical. He said we were just exploiting an inefficiency in the market." It was a rationalization, but one that revealed how Chen had recruited his accomplices. He'd framed the fraud as a victimless crime, a way of exposing the arbitrary pricing in the diamond market. In reality, he had stolen millions from buyers who thought they were purchasing rare natural stones. Sarah's analysis of the trace impurities in the Star of Kinshasa confirmed it had indeed been produced at Premier Diamond Technologies. The specific pattern of minor impurities, trace amounts of iron and nickel from the synthesis chamber's alloy components, matched Premier's signature. The company was cooperating with the investigation, reviewing their production logs to determine when and how Chen had obtained the stone. The most likely scenario was that Chen had commissioned the diamond while still employed at Premier, using his position to access their equipment. He'd specified the size, clarity, and color grade to match high-value natural diamonds that were likely to appear on the market. When he left the company, he'd taken the synthetic stones with him. Marcus Beaumont coordinated Chen's arrest with Singapore authorities. The material scientist was apprehended at his apartment, surrounded by gemological equipment and documentation of planned future fraud operations. In his safe, investigators found 3 more large synthetic diamonds ready to be introduced into the supply chain. The scope of Chen's operation was sobering. Over 18 months, he'd successfully sold at least 8 synthetic diamonds as natural stones, defrauding buyers of an estimated $22 million. The Star of Kinshasa had been his largest single fraud, but he'd been steadily working his way up, testing the system with smaller stones before attempting the museum sale. In Unine's university lab, Sarah prepared a detailed report on the detection methods that had exposed the fraud. She documented each test, each subtle indicator that had revealed the diamond's synthetic origin. The report would be circulated to gemological laboratories worldwide, helping to prevent future frauds. The irony, she told Margaret during one of their final meetings, is that Chen was partially right. Synthetic diamonds are chemically identical to natural ones. They're equally beautiful, equally durable. Only difference is origin, and therefore rarity. But that difference matters enormously in terms of value. Do you think this will change how people view diamonds? Margaret asked. It should, Sarah said. The technology for creating high-quality synthetic diamonds is improving constantly. Within a few years, it may become impossible to distinguish them from natural stones without highly specialized testing. The market will have to adapt, either by accepting synthetics as equivalent or by developing new ways to verify origin. The Ashford Museum issued a statement acknowledging they'd been defrauded, praising Dr. Winters for her detective work, and announcing enhanced authentication procedures for future acquisitions. The Pemberton Foundation, while disappointed by the loss, expressed confidence in the museum's response. 3 months after Sarah's initial examination, Chen Wei pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud in Singapore courts. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims, though most of the money had been spent, making full recovery unlikely. Van Decker faced his own legal proceedings in Belgium. His career in the diamond trade permanently ended. The synthetic diamond that had briefly been the Star of Kinshasa was retained as evidence, stored in a police facility rather than a museum vault. Eventually, it would be returned to the Ashford, perhaps to be displayed with new context, not as a rare natural treasure, but as evidence of how science and deception can create convincing facsimiles of geological miracles. Sarah Winters continued her work, her reputation enhanced by the case. She'd exposed a fraud that could have remained hidden, protecting the integrity of gemological science. In the months that followed, several other institutions contacted her to review their diamond acquisitions. She found 2 more synthetics, both from Chen's operation, both representing similar frauds. The case became a teaching moment. The Merchants Trust Bank of Cleveland stood on the corner of Euclid Avenue like a granite monument to fiscal responsibility. Its marble columns and brass fixtures gleamed under the Ohio sun in the spring of 1967, projecting an image of unshakable stability. Inside, behind the teller windows and vault doors, 23 employees maintained the financial lives of over 4,000 customers. Among them was Harold Pemberton, a man so unremarkable that most customers couldn't recall his face even after years of service. Harold had worked as a senior bookkeeper at Merchants Trust for 11 years. He arrived each morning at 8:15, exactly 15 minutes early, carrying the same brown leather briefcase and wearing one of his 3 rotating gray suits. His desk occupied a quiet corner of the back office, surrounded by filing cabinets and the constant whisper of adding machines. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, took his lunch at precisely noon, and left at 5 o'clock with the regularity of a metronome. The year was 1963 when Harold Pemberton made a decision that would eventually unravel his entire life. His daughter needed surgery, an expensive procedure that his modest salary and meager savings couldn't cover. The hospital required a deposit. His wife's eyes had held such desperate hope when she looked at him, such absolute faith that he would find a way. Harold had always found a way. He was a responsible man, a careful man, a man who balanced accounts down to the penny. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, with rain streaking the windows and most of his colleagues at a retirement luncheon, Harold made his first adjustment. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins maintained a savings account with a balance of $3,472. Harold's fountain pen hovered over the ledger for a full minute before he changed the final digit from a 2 to a 1. $1. Mrs. Hutchins would never notice $1 missing. The bank's quarterly statements rounded to the nearest $5 anyway. He took 10 $1 adjustments that first week. 10 customers, each missing a single dollar they would never know about. Harold deposited the $10 into his daughter's medical fund. She had her surgery, she recovered beautifully, and Harold discovered that the terrible knot of anxiety that had lived in his chest for months had loosened just slightly. The adjustments continued. Harold was methodical, never greedy, never obvious. He developed a system. He targeted accounts with balances over $1,000, accounts that showed regular activity, accounts belonging to customers who rarely checked their statements carefully. He never took more than $5 at a time. He never hit the same account more than once every 6 months. He spread his activities across different account types: savings accounts, checking accounts, certificates of deposit. By 1965, Harold had perfected his technique. He knew which customers received monthly statements and which received quarterly statements. He understood the bank's audit schedule and made sure his adjustments were always more than 6 months old by the time any review occurred. He knew that the human eye, even a trained auditor's eye, would skip over small discrepancies in accounts with lengthy transaction histories. A missing $2 in an account that processed dozens of transactions monthly simply disappeared into the noise. The money accumulated slowly but steadily. Harold paid for his daughter's follow-up treatments. He repaired the roof that had been leaking for 3 years. He bought his wife a modest pearl necklace for their anniversary, the first real jewelry he had been able to afford in their 20-year marriage. He felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was providing adequately for his family. The guilt that had consumed him after those first few adjustments gradually faded, replaced by a quiet rationalization. The bank had millions. These customers had thousands. He took only dollars, sometimes even cents. He wasn't hurting anyone. But Harold Pemberton had a problem, one he didn't fully recognize until years into his scheme. He couldn't remember which accounts he had adjusted or when he had adjusted them. The beauty of his system, its very invisibility, created a paradox. He needed to keep track of his thefts to avoid patterns that might trigger detection, but he couldn't keep written records that might expose him. He certainly couldn't rely on the official ledgers, which now reflected his falsified figures. So Harold developed a secondary system, one that existed in the margins of legitimacy. Using the lightest possible touch of his pencil in the narrow margins of the account ledgers, he began making tiny marks, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal cross. Tally marks, the kind of marks a prisoner might scratch on a cell wall to count passing days, the kind of marks that meant nothing to anyone glancing at a page, marks that could be mistaken for smudges or artifacts of handling. But to Harold, each group of 5 marks represented $5 removed from that account. Each mark was a monument to his crime and his salvation. For 4 years, Harold's system worked flawlessly. The bank's quarterly audits revealed nothing unusual. Customer complaints were non-existent. The missing money, spread across hundreds of accounts over years, amounted to less than 0.03% of the bank's total deposits. It was statistical noise, invisible against the backdrop of millions in daily transactions. Harold Pemberton had committed the perfect crime, one that could continue indefinitely, one that might never be discovered. He had beaten the system through patience, caution, and an intimate understanding of banking's blind spots. What he didn't know was that his tiny pencil marks, those desperate little monuments to his own deception, would become the instrument of his complete destruction. Margaret Weissman had made a career out of finding money that didn't want to be found. At 42 years old, she was one of only a handful of certified forensic accountants in the Midwest, a specialist called upon when traditional audits failed and when the scent of financial impropriety hung in the air, but the source remained maddeningly invisible. She had cut her teeth on insurance fraud cases during the war, evolved through corporate embezzlement investigations in the prosperous 50s, and by 1967 had developed a reputation that preceded her like a cold wind. The call from Merchants Trust Bank came on a Wednesday morning in March. Thomas Aldridge, the bank's senior vice president, had tried to sound casual on the telephone, but Margaret heard the tension beneath his practiced calm. Banks didn't hire forensic accountants casually. They hired them when something was wrong, deeply wrong, and when they needed absolute discretion before involving authorities or alarming customers. Margaret arrived at the bank on a gray Monday morning, dressed in her standard navy suit and carrying a leather satchel containing her notebooks, magnifying glasses, and a reputation for unsettling persistence. Aldridge met her in a conference room, away from the main floor, away from curious eyes and listening ears. He was a tall man with silver hair and the careful bearing of someone accustomed to projecting confidence even when he felt none. The problem, he explained, was nebulous. For the past 2 years, the bank's year-end reconciliations had been showing persistent minor discrepancies. Nothing alarming, nothing that suggested major theft or institutional failure, but something that nagged at him like a pebble in a shoe. The numbers were always slightly off, always in the bank's favor, which seemed positive, except that it shouldn't be happening at all. Proper bookkeeping should balance precisely, not approximately. The bank's internal auditors had reviewed the books 3 times and found nothing irregular. Every transaction was properly documented, every account reconciled according to standard procedures. every entry signed by authorized personnel. The discrepancies appeared to be the result of accumulated rounding errors, minor customer mistakes in their own record-keeping, or perhaps systemic quirks in how interest calculations were processed. The auditors had recommended accepting these small variances as the inevitable cost of processing thousands of transactions monthly. But Aldridge couldn't let it go. Something felt wrong. He had been in banking for 28 years, and he had developed an instinct for the difference between ordinary imperfection and the footprint of deliberate deception. He wanted Margaret to conduct what he called an independent verification, a fresh set of eyes on their processes and procedures. He wanted either confirmation that the discrepancies were indeed benign or evidence of whatever was actually occurring. Margaret spent her first week learning the bank's systems. She reviewed their accounting procedures, interviewed the bookkeeping staff, examined their filing systems and cross-referencing methods. She studied the flow of paperwork from teller windows to ledger entries to monthly statements. She analyzed the bank's audit procedures, looking for gaps or oversights that might allow irregularities to slip through. On the surface, everything appeared sound. Merchants Trust ran a tight operation with appropriate controls and oversight. The bookkeeping staff consisted of 7 people working under the supervision of Martin Hendricks, a veteran banker who had been with Merchants Trust for 19 years. Margaret interviewed each of them. They were, without exception, professional, knowledgeable, and apparently honest. Most had been with the bank for years. All understood their responsibilities clearly. None showed signs of living beyond their means or experiencing financial stress that might motivate theft. Harold Pemberton was among those Margaret interviewed. He sat across from her in the conference room, hands folded on the table, answering her questions with quiet precision. He explained his role as senior bookkeeper, his responsibilities for maintaining account ledgers, his procedures for recording transactions and verifying balances. He had been with the bank for 11 years. His personnel file showed perfect attendance, no disciplinary actions, and consistent, satisfactory performance reviews. He was, by all appearances, exactly what he seemed: a competent, reliable, thoroughly unremarkable employee. Something about Harold Pemberton bothered Margaret, though she couldn't articulate what. Perhaps it was the way his eyes never quite met hers, or the slight tremor in his hands when he touched the ledger books she had brought to the interview, or the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the conference room. Or perhaps it was simply her instinct, honed by years of investigation, that recognized fear when it sat across from her wearing a gray suit and speaking in measured tones. Margaret returned to the ledgers. If theft was occurring, it would leave traces. Money didn't simply vanish. Someone had to take it, which meant someone had to falsify records to hide the taking. The question was where to look in the vast paper landscape of the bank's accounting system. Traditional audits focused on large transactions and significant discrepancies. They looked for obvious anomalies, clear deviations from normal patterns. But Margaret had learned that the most successful embezzlers were those who understood that same audit logic and designed their thefts to exploit its blind spots. She began with the discrepancies Aldridge had mentioned. Over 2 years, the bank's reconciliations showed it held approximately $3,000 more than it should based on customer account totals. $3,000 across 4,000 accounts over 24 months. Less than $1 per account per year. The kind of variance that could easily be attributed to rounding errors or minor customer mistakes in their own record keeping, or perhaps systemic quirks in how interest calculations were processed. The auditors had recommended accepting these small variances as the inevitable cost of processing thousands of transactions monthly. But Margaret didn't believe in coincidental discrepancies. In her experience, when money went missing, someone had taken it. When money appeared unexpectedly, someone had hidden their theft poorly. The question wasn't whether embezzlement was occurring. The question was who, how, and where to find the proof. Margaret established her workspace in a small, windowless room on the bank's second floor, away from the daily bustle of banking operations. The room had previously served as auxiliary storage, and it still smelled of old paper and dust. She requested a sturdy desk, good lighting, and absolute privacy. For the next 3 weeks, she wanted no interruptions, no questions, and no observers. When investigating potential embezzlement, she had learned, the investigator's isolation was as important as the evidence itself. Guilty parties grew nervous when they couldn't monitor the investigation's progress. The ledgers arrived in chronological sequence, heavy volumes bound in green cloth, each covering 6 months of transactions. Margaret started with the most recent and worked backward. She wasn't looking at the numbers initially. She was looking at the pages themselves, studying them the way an art historian studies a painting, searching for anomalies in the physical record before concerning herself with the mathematical content. Each page represented a different customer account. The entries were handwritten in various hands, reflecting the multiple bookkeepers who might touch an account over time. Deposits appeared in one column, withdrawals in another, with running balances calculated at the end of each line. The handwriting was generally neat, the arithmetic sound, the procedures apparently followed correctly. Page after page of unremarkable bookkeeping, the mundane choreography of money moving through time. Margaret used a magnifying glass, examining each page systematically. She looked for erasures, evidence of overwriting, changes in ink color that might suggest alterations made after the fact. She checked the paper itself for signs of different writing implements, pressure variations, or temporal inconsistencies. She was searching for the physical evidence of deception, the places where someone had tried to rewrite financial history. On the 4th day, working through ledgers from mid-1966, Margaret noticed something odd. In the margin of an account page, barely visible unless you looked at the right angle under good light, were tiny pencil marks, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal slash. Tally marks. She almost dismissed them as accidental, the kind of stray marks that accumulate on well-used documents. But then she saw them again, on another page, and then another. Always in the margins, always in the same faint pencil, always following the same pattern. Margaret felt the familiar electricity that came with discovering a thread worth pulling. She retrieved the ledgers she had already examined and went through them again, this time specifically looking for these marginal marks. They were everywhere, scattered across hundreds of pages, invisible unless you were specifically looking for them. Someone had been making tiny tally marks in the margins of customer account ledgers for years. The marks appeared on accounts across all types: savings, checking, certificates of deposit. They seemed random at first, with no obvious pattern linking marked accounts to unmarked ones. Some pages had single marks, others had multiple groups. The marks appeared to be old, made over time, with variations in pencil darkness suggesting they had been added during different sessions. Someone had been systematically marking ledger pages for an extended period. But why? Margaret began correlating the marks with the account data. She created a spreadsheet listing every account that bore these marginal notations, recording the account balance, transaction frequency, and customer information. She counted the tally marks on each page: 5 marks, 10 marks, 15 marks. Each group of 5 carefully organized with 4 vertical lines and a diagonal cross, the elementary school method for counting by fives. Then she started checking the accounts themselves against customer records. She requested original deposit slips, withdrawal receipts, monthly statements, and transaction confirmations. She began reconstructing the true history of these accounts, independent of what the ledgers claimed. This was painstaking work, requiring her to track down paperwork that was sometimes years old, filed in different locations, requiring authorization from multiple departments. But Margaret was methodical and she was patient. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. The marked accounts showed systematic discrepancies. Customer records, their deposit slips and withdrawal receipts, indicated they should have slightly more money than the ledgers claimed. Not much more. $2 here, $5 there. Small amounts that individual customers would never notice, especially given that monthly statements rounded to the nearest $5. But the discrepancies were real, consistent, and they always favored the bank. Margaret counted the tally marks on a page, multiplied by 5, and compared the result to the cumulative discrepancy in that account. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was too close to be coincidental. Each tally mark represented approximately $1 stolen from that account. Whoever had been making these marks had been using them to track their own theft, creating a secret accounting system hidden in plain sight. She expanded her analysis, pulling more records, correlating more accounts. The pattern held. Over 4 years, someone had been systematically stealing small amounts from customer accounts and using these nearly invisible tally marks to maintain an accurate count of their crimes. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its audacity. The thief had been literally writing down their crimes in the official bank records, confident that no one would notice marks too small to see and too meaningless to interpret. Margaret estimated the total theft at approximately $12,000, spread across more than 300 accounts over 4 years. The amounts were so small, the pattern so dispersed, that traditional audits had completely missed it. The bank's reconciliation discrepancies that had troubled Aldridge were actually the residue of these tiny thefts, the mathematical echo of systematic fraud. Now came the crucial question: who? The tally marks had been made with pencil, which meant they could have been added by anyone with access to the ledgers. But the handwriting in the margins matched the handwriting in certain account entries. Margaret retrieved samples of all the bookkeeper's handwriting, disguising her purpose by requesting routine documentation from each staff member. She compared the writing samples to the ledger entries and the marginal marks using a microscope and careful analysis of letter formation, pressure patterns, and stylistic quirks. 3 days later, Margaret had her answer. The handwriting belonged to Harold Pemberton. The quiet, unremarkable senior bookkeeper had been robbing his employer for 4 years, and he had been so desperate to track his own crimes that he had created a secret map of his guilt in the very records that would ultimately condemn him. Margaret presented her findings to Thomas Aldrich in the same conference room where he had first explained the bank's mysterious discrepancies. She had prepared a detailed report documenting the tally marks, the account discrepancies, the handwriting analysis, and the timeline of thefts. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. No single piece would convict Harold Pemberton in court, but the accumulated weight of hundreds of correlations created a picture that was difficult to dispute. Aldrich studied the report in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finally looked up, his face showed not anger, but a profound sadness. Harold Pemberton had worked at Merchants Trust for 11 years. He had been reliable, trustworthy, invisible. The kind of employee you forget to worry about because he never gives you reason to worry. And that invisibility, that trustworthiness, had been both his disguise and his weapon. The question now was how to proceed. Margaret recommended confronting Pemberton directly before involving police. Often, when presented with irrefutable evidence, embezzlers confessed. They were frequently exhausted by the constant stress of maintaining their deceptions, and confrontation came almost as a relief. A confession would simplify prosecution and recovery efforts. Without a confession, building a criminal case from handwriting analysis and tally mark correlations would be challenging. Aldrich agreed. They would bring Pemberton in, present the evidence, and offer him an opportunity to explain himself. If he confessed, they would turn the matter over to authorities. If he denied the charges, they would terminate his employment and pursue both criminal and civil proceedings. Either way, Harold Pemberton's career at Merchants Trust Bank was over. They summoned him on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Margaret watched through a discreet gap in the conference room door as Pemberton walked down the hallway toward his reckoning. He looked smaller than she remembered from their initial interview, his gray suit hanging loose on his frame, his briefcase clutched with white knuckles. He knew. Somehow he knew. Perhaps he had noticed her examining the ledgers. Perhaps he had felt the investigation tightening around him like a noose. Or perhaps he had simply been waiting for this moment for 4 years, knowing it would eventually arrive. Pemberton entered the conference room and stopped when he saw Margaret sitting beside Aldrich. His face went pale. His briefcase slipped from his fingers and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant clatter of typewriters from the offices below and Pemberton's rapid, shallow breathing. Aldrich gestured to a chair. Pemberton sat mechanically, his movements stiff and uncertain. Margaret placed one of the ledgers on the table between them, open to a page showing clear tally marks in the margin. She had highlighted several marks with yellow translucent paper, making them visible even in the conference room's indirect lighting. She explained what she had found: the marks, the account discrepancies, the handwriting analysis, and the timeline of thefts. She spoke calmly, without accusation, simply presenting facts as if discussing abstract accounting principles rather than crimes that would destroy a man's life. When she finished, silence filled the room like water. Harold Pemberton stared at the tally marks on the page. His hands trembled. A tear rolled down his cheek, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I needed to remember which ones. I couldn't write it down anywhere else. I couldn't keep a list, but I needed to remember. I couldn't hit the same account twice. I couldn't create a pattern, so I marked them, just tiny marks. I thought nobody would ever notice. I thought they looked like smudges. The confession spilled out of him like water from a broken dam. He told them about his daughter's surgery, the medical bills, the desperate night when he first changed a ledger entry. He explained his system, his careful selection of accounts, his deliberate dispersal of thefts across time and account types. He detailed his rationalizations. The amounts were so small, the customers would never notice. The bank had so much money. He was only taking what he needed to provide for his family. He had stolen $12,340 over 4 years. He could account for every penny. He had kept a notebook at home, hidden in his basement workshop, logging every theft with date, account number, and amount. He would provide it to them. He would cooperate fully. He only asked that they not tell his wife until he had a chance to explain it to her himself. Margaret asked about the tally marks. Why had he created such an obvious record? Pemberton laughed, a hollow sound without humor. The marks weren't obvious. They were invisible. He had made thousands of them over 4 years and no one had noticed. Bank auditors had reviewed those same pages repeatedly and seen nothing. The marks were his security, his way of maintaining control over a system that might otherwise consume him. The irony was crushing. The very thing he had created to protect himself, to maintain order in his chaotic double life, had become the instrument of his exposure. The marks that were supposed to be invisible had become the most visible evidence of his guilt. The system he built to prevent detection had guaranteed his detection because it was the one element of his crime that existed in the permanent record, unchangeable and undeniable. Aldridge asked the question that Margaret had been wondering. Was Pemberton the only one? Were there other employees stealing from the bank using different methods? Pemberton shook his head vigorously. He had watched his colleagues carefully for years, looking for signs that someone else might be doing what he was doing. He had seen nothing. He had been alone in his crimes, alone in his guilt, and now alone in his exposure. The meeting ended with arrangements for Pemberton to surrender himself to police the following morning. He would bring his notebook, provide a complete written confession, and cooperate with recovery efforts. Aldridge assured him that the bank would not publicize the case unnecessarily, though it would be impossible to keep it completely quiet once criminal proceedings began. Harold Pemberton was arrested on Friday, April 28, 1967, at the Merchants Trust Bank main office. He surrendered voluntarily, accompanied by a court-appointed attorney, carrying the spiral notebook from his basement that contained 4 years of meticulously recorded thefts. The arrest was conducted discreetly during lunch hour when most staff were away from their desks. By 5 o'clock, his desk had been cleared, his employment terminated, and the first news reports were beginning to circulate about a bookkeeper accused of embezzling more than $12,000 from a Cleveland bank. The story made the front page of the Cleveland Plain Dealer the following Monday. Bank bookkeeper arrested in 4-year theft scheme. The article described the basic facts, but missed the detail that Margaret Weissman found most significant. The tally marks, those tiny pencil scratches that had undone such an elaborate scheme. The reporter had focused on the amounts stolen and the methods used, treating it as a standard embezzlement case. But to Margaret, the tally marks represented something more profound about human nature and the psychology of crime. Harold had been unable to resist the need for order, even in his disorder. He had built a criminal enterprise founded on chaos, on small distortions of truth scattered across hundreds of accounts, but his mind had demanded a reliable record. He couldn't trust his memory. He couldn't keep external documentation. So he had embedded his accounting into the very system he was corrupting, creating a parallel truth in the margins where official lies lived in the center columns. The trial began in November 1967. Pemberton pleaded guilty to 4 counts of embezzlement and 3 counts of fraud. His attorney argued for leniency based on his clean record, his motivation to pay medical bills, and his full cooperation with authorities. The prosecutor countered that Pemberton had violated a sacred trust, stolen from customers who had relied on the bank's integrity and had done so systematically over 4 years, which demonstrated not desperation but calculated criminal intent. Margaret testified as an expert witness, explaining how she had discovered the tally marks and connected them to the account discrepancies. The judge listened with visible fascination as she described the investigation, asking detailed questions about forensic accounting techniques and the psychology of embezzlers. When asked why Pemberton had left so obvious evidence of his crimes, Margaret explained that the marks weren't obvious to someone not looking for them. They were invisible until they weren't, meaningful only when interpreted through the lens of suspicion and careful analysis. Harold Pemberton was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 3 years. The judge noted that while Pemberton's motivation was understandable, his methods were inexcusable. He had not stolen once in desperation, but hundreds of times over years, suggesting a comfort with criminality that could not be attributed solely to medical emergency. The sentence was meant to punish, deter, and reflect society's intolerance for breach of financial trust. The bank implemented new security procedures in the wake of the scandal. Dual control systems were established, requiring 2 people to verify any account adjustment. Computerized reconciliation systems were introduced to flag discrepancies faster than human auditors could. Random rotation of bookkeeper assignments prevented anyone from becoming too familiar with specific accounts. The changes cost money, but provided peace of mind. Margaret returned to her regular practice, her reputation enhanced by the successful resolution of the case. She would go on to investigate dozens more cases of embezzlement, fraud, and financial malfeasance over her career, but the Pemberton case remained one of her favorites. It exemplified the principle she had learned early in her career. Criminals almost always create evidence of their crimes, even when they believe they're being invisible. The human need for order, for documentation, for a secret truth that balances the public lie, eventually betrays them. Harold Pemberton served 3 years and 4 months at the Mansfield Reformation before being released on parole in March 1971. He had been a model prisoner, working in the prison library, taking correspondence courses in accounting ethics, ironically enough, and maintaining a spotless disciplinary record. Upon release, he found work as a warehouse clerk, a job that kept him away from financial records and temptation. His wife had divorced him during his imprisonment, and his daughter, now a teenager, refused contact. He lived alone in a small apartment on Cleveland's west side. The $12,000 he had stolen was never fully recovered. Some had been spent on medical bills, some on household expenses, some absorbed into the general flow of life. The bank absorbed the loss, spreading it across their insurance coverage and operating budget. The affected customers were quietly notified and reimbursed, with most expressing surprise that anything had been wrong with their accounts in the first place. Harold had been right about one thing. Individually, the thefts were too small to notice. In December 1975, 8 years after his arrest, Harold Pemberton died of a heart attack at age 53. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer was 3 sentences long and did not mention his conviction. He was buried in a modest cemetery on the city's outskirts, attended by a handful of former colleagues who remembered the quiet, unremarkable bookkeeper he had been before his fall. Margaret Weissman kept one of the original ledger pages from the case, a page showing particularly clear tally marks in the margin. She had it framed and hung it in her office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The reminder was simple. The marks we leave behind tell our true stories even when we believe we're writing nothing. Every crime leaves a signature. Every deception creates a record. Every lie requires a secret truth to balance it. In the end, what undoes us is not always our crimes themselves, but our inability to live with them invisibly. We need to count, to measure, to mark our transgressions in the margins of life, and those marks eventually become the evidence that exposes us. The case of the tally mark thief closed officially in 1971 when Harold Pemberton completed his parole, but its lesson remained permanent. In the ledgers of crime and justice, nothing is ever truly invisible. The call came in at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning. Detective Sarah Chen had been awake for less than an hour, still nursing her first coffee when dispatch relayed the address, the Holloway estate. Even through the static of the radio, she could hear the uncertainty in the dispatcher's voice. Probable natural death, they said, but the family wanted police presence. The family always wanted police presence when there was money involved. The estate sat behind iron gates at the end of a winding private road, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges that had probably cost more to maintain than Sarah's annual salary. The house itself was a sprawling modernist structure, all clean lines and enormous windows that reflected the morning sun. A uniformed officer met her at the door, looking uncomfortable in the opulent entrance hall. "Detective Chen, I'm Officer Martinez. The deceased is Harrison Holloway, 72, found by his housekeeper, Mrs. Delacroix, approximately 2 hours ago. She's in the kitchen, pretty shaken up." Sarah followed Martinez through hallways lined with expensive art. "What do we know so far?" Mr. Holloway was a recluse, apparently, made his fortune in tech security systems back in the 90s, then basically disappeared from public life about 15 years ago. Lives here alone except for the housekeeper who comes 3 times a week. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. The medical examiner is already inside. They descended a staircase into what appeared to be a basement level, though calling it a basement seemed inadequate. The corridor was climate-controlled, softly lit, with thick carpeting that absorbed their footsteps. At the end stood a heavy steel door, currently propped open with a doorstop. The panic room, Martinez explained. Custom built, according to the housekeeper. Mr. Holloway had it installed about 10 years ago. Spent most of his time in there, she said. Sarah stepped through the doorway and found herself in a space that looked more like a luxury apartment than a panic room. The main area was perhaps 20 by 15 feet, furnished with a leather armchair, a mahogany desk covered in papers, built-in bookshelves, and a small kitchenette. A door on the far wall presumably led to a bathroom. Everything was immaculate, orderly, controlled. Harrison Holloway sat in the leather chair, head tilted back, eyes closed. If not for the unnatural stillness and the slight discoloration of his skin, he might have been sleeping. Dr. Patricia Wong, the medical examiner, looked up from her preliminary examination. Detective Chen, I'd estimate time of death sometime between midnight and 4 a.m. No obvious signs of trauma, no defensive wounds. At first glance, this looks like cardiac arrest or possibly a stroke. I'll know more after the autopsy, but honestly, this looks like a natural death. The man was 72, lived alone, had a history of heart problems according to the medication bottles I found in the bathroom. Sarah walked slowly around the room, taking in details. A glass of water on the desk, half empty. A book lay open on the side table next to the chair, a bookmark placed carefully to hold the page. Glasses folded neatly beside it. Everything suggested a man who had simply sat down to read and never stood up again. "Tell me about the panic room setup," Sarah said. Dr. Wong gestured around. "State of the art from what I can see. The door is steel reinforced, biometric locks. The walls are concrete reinforced with steel mesh. Independent power supply with battery backup. Air filtration system. Communications array. The man could have survived in here for weeks if necessary." "Can it be locked from the outside?" "That's the interesting part," Martinez interjected. "According to Mrs. Delacroix, no, it can only be locked from the inside. There's an override in case of emergency, but it requires a code and a physical key, both of which Mr. Holloway kept on his person." He pointed to a keychain visible in the dead man's pocket. Sarah examined the door mechanism. It was indeed sophisticated. A biometric scanner, a keypad, and a manual bolt that could only be engaged from inside. So he locked himself in last night. "Apparently that was his routine," Martinez said. "Every night at 10 p.m. he'd come down here, lock himself in, and emerge around 8 a.m. the next morning. Mrs. Delacroix would have breakfast waiting. When he didn't come up this morning by 9, she used the emergency override to check on him. And found him like this." "Exactly." Sarah looked at Harrison Holloway again. There was something too perfect about the scene, too orderly, too peaceful. But she couldn't articulate what bothered her. A man with a weak heart, alone in a locked room with no one else present. The medical examiner saw natural causes. The evidence supported natural causes. "I want a full workup," Sarah said finally. "Toxicology, the works. And I want the room processed completely, every surface, every system." Dr. Wong raised an eyebrow. "Detective, I understand thoroughness, but—" "Humor me," Sarah interrupted. "A man this paranoid, this security conscious, dies alone in his fortress. I want to know why." The doctor nodded slowly. "Your case. I'll have preliminary tox results in 48 hours, full panel in a week." As the crime scene techs began their work, Sarah stood in the doorway and studied the panic room. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that something was wrong. She'd learned long ago to listen to that voice, even when logic suggested otherwise.
especially when logic suggested otherwise.
By Wednesday afternoon, Sarah had constructed a detailed picture of Harrison Holloway's life, and it was exactly as lonely as she'd expected. The man had been brilliant, paranoid, and wealthy, a combination that had isolated him almost completely from the world. She sat across from Margaret Holloway Chen in an anonymous coffee shop downtown, far from the estate. Harrison's niece was 43, impeccably dressed, and clearly irritated at being asked to meet with police. "I don't understand what you're investigating, Detective. Uncle Harrison died of a heart attack. He was old. He was unhealthy, and he lived like a hermit. This seems fairly straightforward." Sarah sipped her coffee. "When did you last see your uncle?" "Christmas, 4 years ago." Margaret's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "He hosted dinner at the estate. It was awkward and strange, and afterward he sent me a note saying he preferred to limit future contact to email. We exchanged perhaps 3 emails in the years since. But you're his sole heir?" "I'm his only living relative. Our side of the family isn't large, Detective. My mother was his only sibling, and she passed away 20 years ago. I have no children, no cousins. It's just me." She set down her cup with deliberate care. "And yes, I'm aware that makes me look suspicious, but I was in Seattle the night he died, at a medical conference. 200 witnesses, hotel records, credit card receipts. I didn't kill my uncle because there was nothing to kill him for. He was going to die soon anyway, and his estate was always going to come to me." "How much are we talking about?" "Approximately $47 million, split between investments, property, and cash. The estate itself is worth another $12 million. Margaret met Sarah's eyes steadily. "I'm a successful oncologist, Detective. I make $300,000 a year. $47 million is life-changing money, but it's not kill your only relative money. Not for me." Sarah believed her, which was frustrating. Margaret had the perfect motive, but she also had an airtight alibi and the kind of calm that came from genuine innocence or truly exceptional sociopathy. Sarah's instincts suggested the former. "Tell me about your uncle's paranoia." Margaret relaxed slightly, settling into a more comfortable topic. "It started about 15 years ago. He'd always been cautious, security conscious. You don't build a fortune in tech security without being somewhat paranoid. But around 2009, 2010, it escalated. He became convinced someone was trying to steal his intellectual property, his money, his identity. He fired most of his staff, installed increasingly elaborate security systems, and stopped leaving the house except for essential medical appointments." "Did he say who he thought was after him?" "Everyone. Business competitors, former employees, the government, random hackers. His paranoia wasn't focused on a specific threat. It was generalized, all-encompassing. My mother tried to get him help, psychiatric care, but he refused. Said therapists were just another way for people to infiltrate his mind." Margaret's expression softened slightly. It was sad, really. He'd been a brilliant, pioneering, and he spent his final years hiding in a basement, afraid of shadows.
After Margaret left, Sarah sat alone with her notes. The preliminary toxicology had come back clean. No poisons, no drugs beyond Holloway's prescribed medications for his heart condition and high blood pressure. The crime scene techs had found nothing unusual in the panic room. Every surface had been processed, every system checked. All normal, all explainable. Dr. Wong had called that morning with the autopsy results. Myocardial infarction, massive heart attack. Given Holloway's medical history, it was almost expected. The case was ready to be closed, labeled as natural death, filed away. Sarah's lieutenant had already suggested as much. Sometimes people just die, Chen. I know you want every death to be a mystery, but this guy was 72 with a bad ticker, living on anxiety and paranoia. His heart gave out. Signed the paperwork and move on. But something still nagged at her. She pulled out the crime scene photos, spreading them across the coffee shop table. The panic room from every angle. The door, the walls, the air vents, and the control panels. Harrison Holloway in his chair, peaceful and still. The air vents. Sarah pulled that photo closer, studying the ceiling. The panic room had its own air filtration system, separate from the house's HVAC. She'd noted it in her initial walkthrough, but hadn't thought much of it. Of course, a panic room would have independent air supply. That was the point. But Harrison Holloway was a security expert. He'd designed systems for a living. If anyone would understand how to exploit a weakness in an air system, or how someone else might exploit it against him. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Dr. Wong's number. It rang 4 times before the medical examiner answered, sounding distracted. "Patricia, it's Sarah Chen, the Holloway case. Can a heart attack be artificially induced?" A long pause. "In theory, yes. Several methods: potassium chloride injection, electrocution, extreme oxygen deprivation. But we tested for all the obvious substances. His blood chemistry was normal except for the expected indicators of cardiac arrest. What about carbon dioxide?" Another pause, longer this time. Carbon dioxide wouldn't show up in a standard tox screen. Elevated CO2 would cause cardiac stress, potentially trigger a heart attack in someone with existing heart disease. But it would dissipate from the blood fairly quickly after death. By the time we got to him, Dr. Wong's voice changed, became more alert. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Sarah said slowly, "that I need to talk to a mechanical engineer."
Dr. Marcus Webb looked nothing like Sarah expected. She'd pictured someone older, gray-haired, probably wearing a wrinkled shirt and thick glasses. Instead, the forensic engineer who met her at the Holloway estate on Thursday morning was 45, athletic, and dressed in expensive outdoor gear, as if he'd just come from a mountain hike. "Detective Chen, Marcus Webb. I specialize in environmental and mechanical systems forensics. Your lieutenant said you had questions about an air filtration system." "Thank you for coming on short notice." Sarah led him toward the basement stairs. "I need you to examine the panic room's air supply system. Tell me if there's any way it could have been manipulated." Marcus followed her down. "Manipulated how?" "I'm not sure yet." "That's what I'm hoping you can tell me." The panic room still stood open, though Harrison Holloway's body had long since been removed. The space felt different now, emptier,
more obviously a tomb than a sanctuary. Marcus stepped inside, immediately looking up at the ceiling vents. "Independent filtration system," he murmured, pulling out a tablet and starting to make notes. "Smart for a panic room. You don't want to rely on the main house systems in an emergency." He walked the perimeter, examining each vent, then moved to a panel on the wall. "This should access the control systems. May I?" "Please." He opened the panel, revealing a complex array of switches, monitors, and diagnostic displays. His fingers flew across the screen, pulling up readouts and logs. "Okay, so this is actually quite sophisticated. We've got HEPA filtration, positive pressure maintenance, CO2 scrubbing, oxygen monitoring, the works. Military-grade equipment, probably cost $50,000 just for the filtration components. Could it be hacked? Remotely controlled?" Marcus shook his head. "The system appears to be air-gapped, no network connection. That was smart from a security perspective. You can't hack what you can't reach." He paused, studying a particular readout. Although what? "The logs show some interesting patterns. The CO2 levels in the room started rising around midnight last night. I can access. That's normal as someone exhales. But the scrubbing system, which should automatically activate to remove excess CO2, didn't kick in until much later, almost 4 a.m. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Could that cause a heart attack? In someone with pre-existing cardiac issues? Absolutely. Elevated CO2 causes respiratory acidosis, increases cardiac workload, can trigger arrhythmias. If the levels got high enough, it would be like slow suffocation. You'd feel short of breath, confused, panicked. Your heart would be racing, struggling. For someone like Holloway, it could easily trigger a fatal cardiac event. So the system malfunctioned. Maybe. Marcus was staring at the screen, his expression troubled. But here's the thing. These are extremely reliable systems, multiple redundancies, fail-safes. For the CO2 scrubbing system to fail for 4 hours straight, that would require multiple simultaneous component failures. Statistically improbable. But not impossible. Not impossible, he agreed. Let me examine the physical components. For the next 2 hours, Sarah watched as Marcus methodically dismantled sections of the air filtration system. He worked with the precision of a surgeon, photographing each component, testing each connection, running diagnostics on every sensor. She brought him coffee, answered questions about the timeline, and tried to ignore the growing tension in her shoulders. Finally, as afternoon light began filtering down the stairwell, Marcus called her over to where he'd laid out components on a clean sheet. "Look at this," he pointed to what appeared to be a small mechanical valve. "This is the actuator for the CO2 scrubbing system. When CO2 levels reach a certain threshold, this valve opens, redirecting airflow through the scrubbing filters. It's a simple but reliable mechanism." Sarah studied the component. It looked like dozens of other pieces Marcus had removed. "I don't see anything wrong with it." "Exactly. There's nothing wrong with it now. But look here." He zoomed in on his tablet, showing a high-resolution image of a tiny gear inside the valve. "See this tooth? It's been filed down, very precisely, very carefully. Someone modified this gear so that it would fail after a specific number of rotations." The room seemed to grow colder. A time-delayed mechanism? Yes. The valve would work normally for days, weeks, maybe months depending on usage patterns. But once that tooth wore down to a critical point, the gear would slip, the valve would stick closed, the CO2 scrubbing system would fail to activate. Marcus looked up at her.
This wasn't an accident, detective. This was murder. Very patient, very clever murder. Sarah's mind raced through implications. How long would it take for someone to make this modification? 5 minutes maybe, 10 if they knew what they were doing. You'd need access to the room, access to the filtration system, and fairly specialized knowledge of mechanical engineering. But the modification itself is simple. File down a gear tooth, reassemble, wait. Wait for the victim to die. Wait for the victim to die, Marcus confirmed. And here's the really elegant part. Once the gear finally failed and the valve stuck, it would look exactly like ordinary mechanical failure. Age, wear and tear, bad luck. Unless someone specifically looked for this modification, they'd never find it. And why would anyone look? The man died of a heart attack in a locked room. Natural causes. Sarah pulled out her phone, already dialing the lieutenant's number. I need you to write up a detailed report. Every finding, every photograph, every conclusion. This is now officially a homicide investigation. As Marcus nodded and returned to his documentation, Sarah stepped out into the hallway. Her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline of the breakthrough mixing with the cold certainty of what it meant. Someone had murdered Harrison Holloway, with patience and precision, creating a death that would look natural, erasing themselves from the scene entirely. Someone who knew about mechanical systems, someone who had access to the panic room, someone who could wait months for their modified gear to fail, knowing that when it did, an old man with a bad heart would die alone in his fortress, gasping for air that would never be clean enough. Someone very smart and very dangerous. The lieutenant answered on the third ring. Chen, this better be good. We've got a homicide, sir. Holloway was murdered. I need a full investigative team, and I need to know everyone who had access to that house in the past year. A pause. Then, explain. As Sarah laid out Marcus Webb's findings, she stared at the steel door of the panic room. Somewhere out there, a killer was probably feeling very safe, very satisfied. They'd committed the perfect crime. Or so they thought. But perfect crimes depended on no one looking close enough. And Sarah Chen was very good at looking closely.
The conference room at the precinct had been transformed into a command center. One wall was covered with photographs, timelines, and relationship charts. Sarah stood before it on Friday morning, coffee in hand, addressing a room full of detectives and uniformed officers. Okay, people, Harrison Holloway was murdered via mechanical sabotage to his panic room's air filtration system. The modification was made at least 2 weeks ago, possibly as much as 3 months, according to Dr. Webb's analysis of wear patterns. That's our window. I need to know everyone who entered that house during that time. Detective James Park, her partner on the case, pulled up a file. Got the visitor logs from the estate's security system. Holloway was paranoid enough to record everything. Between July 1st and his death on October 15th, only 6 people entered the property besides Holloway himself. Let's hear them. First, Marie Delacroix, the housekeeper. She came 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Been working for Holloway for 12 years. Sarah nodded. She's the one who found him. What do we know about her? 68 years old, widow, clean record, lives in a modest apartment in the city. No obvious financial problems, but also no major savings. She'll inherit $50,000 from Holloway's will, which is generous but not fortune-changing. Put her on the list. Next, Dr. Raymond Foster, Holloway's personal physician, made house calls once a month, Last visit was September 20th, so he's within our window. Motive? Park shrugged. Nothing obvious. He's well established, successful practice, no financial red flags, but I'm still digging. Keep digging. Who else? Thomas Chen, a systems technician from Secure Home Technologies. They maintained all of Holloway's security systems, made service calls on July 15th, August 3rd, and September 12th. Sarah wrote the name on her notepad. That's interesting. He'd have the technical knowledge. Yeah, I thought so too. He's 32, bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, been with Secure Home for 6 years. Clean record, seems like a regular guy, but... Park paused. He's got some interesting debt. Owes about $80,000 on credit cards, another $100,000 in student loans. So he needs money. What's his connection to Holloway's wealth? That's where it gets weird. I can't find one. He's a technician, not someone who would typically be in the will, unless there's something we're missing. Sarah added a star next to his name. We'll come back to him. Next, Alexander Novak, another technician, this one from Climate Solutions. He maintained the HVAC systems, including the panic room's air filtration system. Came by on August 20th. The room went quiet. Sarah turned to face the board fully. The air filtration guy had access to the exact system that was sabotaged? It gets better, Park said grimly. Or worse, depending on your perspective. Alexander Novak is 45, divorced, 2 kids, and 5 years ago he worked for Holloway's company before it was sold. He was laid off when new management took over. So he has a grudge and the means. Sarah wrote his name in red. Top of our list. Who else? Margaret Holloway Chen, the niece. She visited on September 2nd, apparently trying to reconcile with her uncle. She was there for about 90 minutes. She has an alibi for the night of the murder. Yes, but the murder weapon was planted weeks earlier. She could have sabotaged the system, then made sure she was far away when it finally failed. Sarah considered this. Margaret had seemed genuine, but $47 million was a compelling motive. Okay, she stays on the list. Anyone else? Last one is Father Michael Santos from St. Catherine's Parish. He visited 3 times over the summer trying to bring Holloway back into the church. Last visit was July 28th, which is right at the edge of our window. A priest? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Stranger things have happened, though I admit he seems unlikely. 70 years old, been with the parish for 30 years, known for charity work. Hard to picture him filing down gear teeth. Sarah stared at the board, 6 names looking back at her. Okay, here's what we do. Park, you take Dr. Foster and Father Santos. I want their financials, their schedules, their alibis for the modification window. Everything. Got it. Martinez, you and Chen work on Thomas Chen and Alexander Novak. Deep dive into their backgrounds, their connection to Holloway, any grudges or motivations. I want to know what toothpaste they use. The officers nodded. I'll take Marie Delacroix and Margaret Holloway Chen, the women in Holloway's life, such as it was. She paused, studying the photographs. Somewhere in this web of connections and motivations is my killer. Someone patient enough to wait months for a gear to fail. Someone clever enough to commit murder from a distance. Someone who thought they'd gotten away with it. Monday morning, she announced to her team, we bring all 3 in for formal interviews. I want them separated, questioned individually, and I want every word recorded. One of them knows something, and one of them is going to break. Monday morning arrived with cold rain that matched Sarah's mood. She'd spent the weekend reviewing every piece of evidence, every interview transcript,
every financial record. Somewhere in the mass of data was the thread that would unravel the case. She just had to find it. Thomas Chen arrived first at 9 a.m., brought in by Martinez. The young technician looked nervous but not frightened, confused rather than defensive. Sarah watched through the one-way glass as Park began the interview. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming in. We just have a few questions about your work at the Holloway estate." "Sure, okay. Am I in some kind of trouble? I mean, I heard Mr. Holloway died. That's terrible, but I don't see what it has to do with me." "You maintained his security systems, correct?" "Yes, but just the electronic components, alarms, cameras, access controls. I never touched the mechanical stuff." Park laid out photographs of the panic room. "Did you ever work on systems in this room?" "A couple times, yeah. Mr. Holloway was really particular about the biometric locks. But he watched me the whole time, like literally stood over my shoulder. Kind of nerve-wracking, honestly." The interview continued for an hour. Thomas Chen's story was consistent, his demeanor increasingly bewildered as the questions grew more pointed. Sarah made notes, her instincts telling her this wasn't their man. The debt was real, but his confusion seemed genuine. Still, she'd keep him on the list until she was certain. Margaret Holloway Chen arrived at 11, escorted by her attorney. She looked annoyed more than worried, checking her watch as if she had somewhere more important to be. Sarah took this interview herself, sitting across the table from the heiress and her lawyer. "Ms. Holloway Chen, we've learned that your uncle's death wasn't natural. He was murdered." Margaret's expression didn't change. "I see. And you think I'm responsible because I inherit his estate?" "You visited him on September 2nd. What was the purpose of that visit?" "Exactly what I told you before. I was trying to repair our relationship. He'd been so isolated, and I thought maybe if I reached out—" She paused, seemed to reconsider her words. "Look, Detective, yes, I inherit everything. Yes, I benefit from his death, but I didn't kill him. I couldn't have killed him. I was in Seattle when he died." "The method used was time-delayed. You could have set it in motion during your September visit." For the first time, Margaret looked genuinely unsettled. "What do you mean by time-delayed?" Sarah explained the sabotaged gear, watching carefully for any tell, any slip. But Margaret's reaction seemed authentically shocked. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering rapidly, but Margaret waved him off. That's incredibly elaborate and completely beyond my capabilities. I'm a doctor, Detective, not an engineer. I wouldn't know how to modify a gear even if I wanted to." The interview lasted 90 minutes. Margaret never changed her story, never hesitated in ways that suggested deception. When she left, attorney in tow, Sarah had to admit she was probably innocent. Motivated, opportunistic perhaps, but not a killer. Which left Alexander Novak. He arrived at 2 p.m., brought in by 2 uniformed officers despite having come voluntarily. At first glance, he looked unremarkable. Average height, thinning hair, glasses. He wore jeans and a work shirt with Climate Solutions embroidered on the pocket. But his hands, Sarah noticed, were steady. His expression was calm. Too calm. She entered the interview room alone, taking the seat across from him. "Mr. Novak, thank you for coming in." "Of course, though I'm not sure what this is about. I heard Mr. Holloway passed away. Very sad, but I don't understand why you need to talk to me." "You maintained his air filtration systems." "Yes, among other things. Yes, climate control, ventilation,
The panic room's environmental systems? That was my contract. Sarah laid out the photographs. Tell me about the panic room specifically. Novak studied the images with what seemed like professional interest. State of the art. Mr. Holloway spared no expense. The filtration system alone was worth more than my truck. A slight smile. He was very particular about that room. His fortress, he called it. Place where he felt safe. You worked for his company once, before the sale. Yes, 15 years ago. I was a facilities manager. When the new owners took over, they outsourced most of the maintenance staff. I was let go with about 50 other people. His voice remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. That was a difficult time. Were you angry about it? At first, sure. I had a mortgage, a family. Losing your job is never pleasant. But I found other work, built my own business. I moved on. But when you got the contract to maintain Holloway's systems, that must have felt... Novak leaned back, considering. It felt like irony, detective. The man who'd built the company that fired me was now paying me to keep his fortress running. But I'm a professional. I did my job. Sarah let the silence stretch, watching him. He didn't fidget, didn't look away, didn't show the usual tells of deception. He was either innocent or exceptionally controlled. The CO2 scrubbing system in the panic room had been sabotaged. A gear had been filed down to create a time-delayed failure. Someone with detailed knowledge of the system modified it so that it would eventually fail, causing CO2 buildup that would trigger a cardiac event in someone with heart problems. For several seconds, Novak said nothing. Then, slowly, he removed his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt. When he put them back on, his expression had changed, not to fear or guilt, but to something like resignation. "How did you figure it out?" he asked quietly. Sarah felt her pulse spike, but kept her voice level. A forensic engineer examined the system. The modification was expert-level work. Someone who understood both mechanical systems and Holloway's medical vulnerabilities. Novak nodded slowly. I knew it might be found eventually. I hoped it wouldn't be. Hoped it would just be written off as an old man dying of natural causes. But I knew the risk. You want to know why? I do. When I worked for Holloway Security Systems, I wasn't just the facilities manager. I was part of the engineering team that designed some of their most sensitive systems. When the company was sold, the new owners claimed my work as company property, but they also decided it was compromised. They implied I'd been careless with the designs, that competitors might have gained access through my negligence. It wasn't true. But the rumor was enough. For 5 years, I couldn't get work in my field. Nobody would hire the engineer who possibly, had leaked security designs. His voice remained calm, but Sarah could hear the bitterness beneath it. It destroyed my marriage, cost me my house. My kids barely spoke to me for years. I rebuilt my life from nothing, working HVAC jobs I was overqualified for, scraping by. And when you got the contract to maintain Holloway's systems? At first I was professional about it, just another client. But talking to him, seeing him in that panic room, so paranoid and alone, I realized he'd never suffered any consequences. He sold the company, made millions, retired to his fortress. Meanwhile, my life had been ruined based on a false rumor that his company had started to cover their own security failures. So you decided to kill him. I decided he should die the way he had lived, alone, afraid, suffocating in his own fortress. Novak's hands were still steady on the table. It took me 3 visits to plan it properly. The modification was simple once I understood his routines. He was there watching me work on the main filters. I told him I needed to check the CO2 scrubbing valve, showed him some false diagnostic readings. He watched me open the housing, but he couldn't see the gear modification. My hands blocked his view. It took less than 3 minutes. I filed the tooth, reassembled everything, showed him the corrected readings. He thanked me for being thorough. And then you just waited. I calculated it would take between 6 to 10
weeks for the gear to fail completely, depending on usage patterns. Every day I wondered if today would be the day. Every day I expected to hear the news. When it finally happened, he paused, something crossing his face. I thought I'd feel vindicated, satisfied. Instead, I just felt empty. Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Novak, I need you to understand what you're saying. This is a confession to murder, premeditated, calculated murder." "He know what it is, detective. I've known since the moment I filed down that gear. I'm not claiming it was right. I'm not asking for sympathy or understanding. I'm just explaining what happened and why. You need a lawyer. Probably, but I've already told you everything. The modification was mine. The plan was mine. The responsibility is mine." He looked down at his hands. "Will you tell me something? How did the forensic engineer spot the modification? I was so careful." He was looking for something wrong. Most people wouldn't have. The case would have been closed as natural death if... Sarah stopped herself. There was no point in telling him how close he'd come to the perfect crime. Novak smiled faintly. "If not for a detective who doesn't believe in coincidences. I suppose that's fitting. A security expert dies in his secure room, murdered by someone exploiting the very systems meant to protect him. There's a certain poetry to it." Sarah stood. "Alexander Novak, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Harrison Holloway. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, Novak sat quietly, accepting the handcuffs without resistance. There was no drama, no breakdown, no last-minute escape attempt. Just a tired, middle-aged man who'd committed murder for revenge and now faced the consequences with the same calm precision he'd used to plan the crime. Later, after Novak had been processed and transferred to holding, Sarah stood in the observation room, watching him through the glass. Park came up beside her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Hell of a case," he said, offering her a cup. "Yeah," Sarah took the coffee, grateful for the warmth. "The perfect murder, almost. What gave it away, really?" Sarah thought about it. The perfection itself. Everything was too neat, too explainable. A paranoid man dies alone in his fortress from natural causes. It fit the narrative too perfectly, made me look harder. And Novak? He wanted to be caught, I think. Not consciously, maybe, but he left enough clues for someone who looked carefully. The relationship with Holloway that the housekeeper mentioned, the timing of his access. A man that smart could have covered his tracks better if he'd really wanted to disappear. Park nodded slowly. 15 years of bitterness must have eaten him alive. Doesn't justify murder. No, Park agreed, but I can understand the rage. Losing everything because of someone else's carelessness, watching them profit while you suffer. That's a hard poison to swallow.
Sarah finished her coffee, crushing the empty cup. Harrison Holloway built himself a fortress to keep the world out. In the end, he locked himself in with the killer's mechanism, and all his security couldn't save him. There's probably a lesson in there about paranoia and isolation, but I'm too tired to figure out what it is. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Alexander Novak sit motionless in the holding cell. Then Sarah turned away, gathering her files. "Come on, let's get the paperwork finished. The DA will want everything documented for the prosecution." "You think he'll plead guilty?" "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that he's already confessed to everything that matters. The rest is just procedure." She was right. Alexander Novak pleaded guilty 3 weeks later, sparing everyone a trial. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, noting the premeditated nature of the crime and the sophisticated method used. Novak showed no emotion during sentencing, simply nodded when asked if he understood. The Holloway estate went to Margaret, who sold it within 6 months. The panic room was dismantled, the house renovated, and resold to a young tech entrepreneur who knew nothing of its history. Marie Delacroix retired with her inheritance, moving to a small apartment near her daughter's family. Sarah kept the case file on her desk for a while, a reminder of how perfect crimes unravel not through obvious clues, but through the persistence of looking when everyone else has stopped. Eventually, she filed it away with all the others, another closed case in a career full of them. But sometimes, late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she thought about Harrison Holloway dying alone in his fortress, gasping for air that grew steadily more toxic, about Alexander Novak calmly filing down a gear tooth and then waiting weeks for his revenge to unfold, about how paranoia and bitterness can both become prisons, trapping us as effectively as any locked room. The case of the quiet clockwork closed with a confession, a conviction, and justice served, but like all the best cases, it left questions that couldn't be answered by evidence or testimony. Questions about revenge and consequences, about the price of isolation and the wages of grudges held too long. Sarah never forgot those questions. They stayed with her, quiet and persistent, like the tick of clockwork, counting down to an inevitable end. And sometimes, in the silence of her own thoughts, she wondered if we're all just living in locked rooms of our own making, unaware of the mechanisms slowly failing around us until it's too late to escape. The rain continued falling on the city, washing away the last traces of autumn, carrying secrets down dark gutters and storm drains. Life went on, cases piled up, new mysteries demanded attention. But the quiet clockwork kept ticking somewhere in the dark, counting down to endings no one could predict or prevent. That was the nature of time, and murder, and justice. Always ticking, always waiting, always inevitable.
The fluorescent lights of Pacific Gas and Electric's data center hummed their eternal song, a white noise that had become as familiar as breathing to the night shift operators. It was March of 1984, and the company's San Francisco headquarters housed one of the most sophisticated computer systems in the utility industry, a sprawling network of mainframes that tracked billing, consumption patterns, and grid management across Northern California. Martin Kellerman, the senior data administrator, first noticed the anomaly on a Tuesday morning. The numbers didn't add up. Not dramatically. This wasn't the kind of discrepancy that would trigger alarms or cause immediate panic. It was subtler than that, more insidious. Storage capacity reports showed inconsistencies. Backup logs revealed gaps that shouldn't exist. File access timestamps appeared at odd hours, then vanished from subsequent reports as if they'd never been there at all. It's like watching water leak from a crack you can't quite see, Martin told his supervisor, David Chen, over weak coffee in the break room. You know something's wrong because the bucket's filling up, but you can't find the source. David nodded slowly, his engineering mind already working through the possibilities. Hardware failure? Software glitch? Or something more troubling? In 1984, computer crime was still a novelty, something that happened in movies or in the fever dreams of security consultants trying to justify their salaries. Real companies, real data centers, they were fortresses, weren't they? They began a systematic review. Every access log, every batch job, every automated process was scrutinized with the intensity of monks studying ancient manuscripts. The data center operated around the clock, with 3 shifts of technicians maintaining the temperamental mainframes that required constant attention. The machines were powerful but delicate, prone to overheating, to tape drive failures, to the 1,000 small catastrophes that plagued early computer systems. The day shift found nothing unusual, the evening shift equally clean, but the night shift from midnight to 8 in the morning showed patterns that made Martin pause. Small file transfers, always after 2 a.m., always less than an hour in duration. They were logged as routine maintenance procedures, backup verifications, system checks, perfectly mundane activities that any technician might perform. Except they weren't scheduled and they weren't necessary. Martin created a spreadsheet by hand, plotting the occurrences over 3 months, and the pattern emerged like a constellation slowly revealing itself as your eyes adjust to darkness. Every Thursday night, without fail. Occasionally on Tuesdays, never on weekends. Always between 2 and 3:30 in the morning. That dead zone when human attention naturally wanes, when even the most vigilant operators find their minds drifting. "Someone's taking our data," Martin said finally, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. Not all at once, a little bit at a time, like skimming pennies from thousands of accounts, small enough that no single instance raises a flag, but added up. David leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. What kind of data? Customer records mostly, billing information, consumption patterns, and addresses. The kind of information that would be valuable to competitors or to someone planning targeted sales campaigns. Maybe even identity theft, though that's not really a thing yet, is it? But it would be. They both knew it. The digital age was dawning, and with it, entirely new categories of crime that the legal system hadn't even begun to contemplate. The question now was how. The data center was secure, or so they had believed. Badge access controlled entry. Security guards patrolled the floors. The computer room itself was locked, accessible only to authorized personnel. And the data couldn't simply be copied onto a floppy disk and walked out. They were talking about megabytes of information stored on massive tape reels and disk drives.
This wasn't something you could slip into your pocket. That left the network connections, the phone lines. In 1984, remote access meant modems, devices that translated digital data into analog audio signals that could travel over ordinary telephone lines. PG&E had several such connections for legitimate purposes: remote terminals for executives, connections to regional offices, links to other utilities for grid coordination. Each modem had a phone number, and each phone number was supposed to be closely guarded. Martin and David spent the next week doing something that would seem primitive by modern standards, but was cutting-edge detective work at the time. They manually dialed every phone line associated with the building's computer systems, noting which ones answered with the characteristic shriek of modem negotiation. They found 12 active lines. 13 were supposed to exist, one for each authorized connection point. But when they checked the master list, all 13 were accounted for, which meant line number 12 was a ghost, present in reality, absent from official records. Someone installed an unauthorized modem, David said, his voice barely above a whisper, and they've been using it to dial in and extract data. But who? And more importantly for their investigation, when would they strike again? The trap was set. Thursday night, 1:45 a.m. Martin and David waited in the darkened administrative office adjacent to the computer room, surrounded by the gentle clacking of dot matrix printers and the whir of cooling fans. They'd identified which phone line the ghost modem was using. Now they just needed to trace it to its physical location and catch whoever was using it in the act. The waiting was the hardest part. Martin Kellerman sat in the darkened office, watching the luminous hands of the wall clock creep toward 2 a.m. with excruciating slowness. Beside him, David Chen methodically cleaned his glasses for the third time in an hour, a nervous habit he'd never quite managed to break. They'd informed building security of their surveillance operation, but kept the circle of knowledge small. In a company of thousands, trust was a commodity that had to be carefully rationed. The night shift supervisor, Margaret Yates, was one of only 3 people outside Martin and David who knew that something was wrong. She sat at her station in the computer room, ostensibly reviewing system logs, but her real job tonight was to watch and note the behavior of her 4-person crew. At 2:17 a.m., the phone line activated. Martin heard it first, not the ringing, but the subtle click of a connection being established. He'd patched an audio monitor into the line, a simple arrangement of alligator clips and a small speaker borrowed from someone's transistor radio. The speaker crackled to life with the unmistakable sound of modem negotiation. A series of warbling tones, whistles, and electronic shrieks as 2 machines established communication protocol. David was already moving, pulling out the recording equipment they'd borrowed from the company's training department. A bulky reel-to-reel tape recorder, the kind usually reserved for capturing corporate presentations and safety announcements. Tonight it would document what they hoped would be evidence of industrial espionage. The modem sounds continued for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the world of electronic handshakes. Martin recognized the pattern, a 300 baud connection, painfully slow by even 1984 standards, but reliable and, more importantly, quiet. A faster modem would have made more noise, both electronically and acoustically. Whoever was doing this had chosen stealth over efficiency. Through the office window, Martin could see into the computer room. 3 technicians worked at their stations, tending to the mainframes, with the practiced ease of intensive care nurses. The 4th, Thomas Brennan, a lean man in his late 30s with prematurely graying hair, sat at the terminal in the far corner. His back was to the window, his posture relaxed, his fingers moving across the keyboard with occasional deliberate keystrokes. "That's our ghost," David whispered, though there was no way Brennan could have heard them through the heavy glass. But they couldn't move yet. They needed evidence, documentation, something more substantial than suspicious timing. Margaret had strict instructions. Observe, record, but don't intervene unless absolutely necessary. Let him complete the operation. Let him believe he's safe. The data transfer lasted 47 minutes. Martin timed it precisely, watching the second hand sweep around the clock face again and again. The modem sounds were sporadic now, bursts of activity followed by long silences as data traveled from the mainframe through the unauthorized modem, down the phone line, to where? That was the question that had kept Martin awake for the past several nights. Where was the data going? At 3:04 a.m., the connection terminated. A final series of electronic tones, then silence. Through the window, they watched Brennan stretch, roll his shoulders, and walk away from the terminal toward the break room, moving with the casual ease of someone who'd completed a routine task. "Got it," David said softly, stopping the recording equipment. 47 minutes of audio documentation. But audio alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to trace the physical connection, to find the actual modem hardware that Brennan was using. The building had thousands of phone outlets, spread across 12 floors and covering a city block. Somewhere in that maze of wiring and conduits was a small box converting digital theft into analog signals. Martin had a plan for that too. He'd called in a favor from an old college friend who now worked for Pacific Bell. Gerald Thompson was a telecommunications engineer, one of the people responsible for maintaining the vast network of copper wire that connected the Bay Area. More importantly, he understood phone system forensics in a way that few people did. Gerald arrived at 4 a.m., carrying a metal case that looked like it belonged to a traveling salesman. He set it on Martin's desk and opened it to reveal an array of tools, testing equipment, and what looked like a modified telephone handset with various meters and displays attached. "You want me to find a rogue modem in this building without knowing which floor it's on or which phone line it's connected to." "Can you do it?" Martin asked. Gerald smiled, the expression of a craftsman presented with an interesting challenge. Phone lines leave traces. Every connection, every call, every bit of data creates electromagnetic signatures, voltage fluctuations, line noise patterns. Most people don't know how to read them. I do. He started with the phone closet on the building's ground floor, where the main distribution frame connected external lines to internal wiring. Using his modified handset and what he called a line tracer, he began methodically testing circuits. He explained as he worked, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher helping a struggling student. "See, when a modem connects, it doesn't just use the phone line, it subtly changes its electrical characteristics. Impedance shifts, signal reflections, harmonic distortions. These changes are minute, but they're measurable. And they're cumulative. A line that's been used regularly for modem traffic develops a signature, like the way a repeatedly traveled path in the woods becomes worn down and distinct. It took him 6 hours. The sun was already rising, painting the San Francisco skyline in shades of orange and pink, when Gerald finally looked up from his equipment with satisfaction. Got it. 7th floor, southeast corner. The line terminates at an outlet in, he consulted his notes, room 714. According to the building directory, that's a storage room for computer supplies. Martin and David exchanged glances. Room 714. They'd walked past it 100 times, never giving it a second thought. Just another closet full of printer paper, toner cartridges, and spare parts for the aging terminals that populated every desk in the building. Let's see what Thomas Brennan has been hiding.
Room 714 was locked, but Margaret Yates had the master key. She'd finished her night shift 2 hours earlier, but had agreed to stay, driven by the same mixture of professional duty and personal curiosity that had kept Martin and David awake for days. The three of them stood outside the nondescript door, institutional beige paint over hollow core construction, while building security guard Raymond Torres watched with barely concealed interest. "You want me to be here for this?" Raymond asked. He was a retired police officer, 2 years past his SFPD pension, and finding that corporate security work suited his temperament better than he'd expected. "If there's evidence of a crime—" "Yes," David said firmly. "We need a witness, someone outside the IT department." The key turned with a soft click. Martin pushed the door open, reaching inside for the light switch. Fluorescent tubes flickered to life, revealing a space that was exactly what it claimed to be, a storage room. Metal shelving units lined 3 walls, packed with the mundane supplies of 1980s office work. Boxes of continuous feed paper, cartons of ribbon cartridges for line printers, spare keyboards still in their original packaging, cleaning supplies for the delicate read-write heads of tape drives. But, tucked behind a shelf unit in the far corner, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, sat a small wooden crate. Inside the crate, nested in foam padding like a precious artifact, was a Hayes Smart Modem 300. Martin felt his pulse quicken. There it was, the physical evidence they needed. The device was connected to a phone jack that shouldn't have existed, a line that appeared nowhere in the building's official telecommunications records. Someone, and the circumstantial evidence pointed overwhelmingly at Thomas Brennan, had installed this connection, probably months ago, and had been using it to systematically drain data from the company's computers. "Don't touch it yet," David cautioned. He produced a Polaroid camera from his bag and began documenting the scene, the instant film whirring out with each shot. The modem from multiple angles, the phone connection, the serial number plate, the way the device was positioned and concealed. Gerald Thompson, who'd accompanied them upstairs, knelt beside the modem with his testing equipment. "Let me check for fingerprints before we disturb anything," he said, then paused. "Actually, that's probably pointless. He's been handling this for months. His prints will be everywhere, along with prints from whoever else has legitimately accessed this storage room. What we need," Martin said slowly, thinking it through, "is to catch him using it. We have the audio recordings from last night. We have the physical device. But what we don't have is direct evidence linking Brennan to the theft. A good lawyer could argue that anyone with access to this room could have installed the modem." "How many people have access?" Raymond asked. Margaret consulted a clipboard she'd brought. Everyone on the night shift technical crew has badge access to supply rooms. That's 12 people across 3 teams, plus janitorial staff, building maintenance, and management. So potentially dozens of people, David said, frustrated. But Martin was smiling. No, not potentially dozens, one person, because whoever did this needed very specific knowledge, not just how to install a modem, but how to access the mainframe remotely, how to navigate the file systems, how to extract data without triggering security alerts. That requires intimate familiarity with our computer systems. He turned to Margaret. Of the 12 people with badge access to this room who work night shift, how many are qualified to perform remote system administration? Margaret didn't need to check her notes. 3. Thomas Brennan, Alice Wu, and Robert Martinez. And of those 3, how many have been working the night shift on every Thursday night for the past 6 months? Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Just Thomas. Alice transferred to nights only 3 months ago, and Robert has rotating days off that don't align with the pattern you showed me. It's circumstantial, but it's compelling. More importantly, they now had a plan to catch him in the act. Not just recording modem sounds in the dark, but observing the entire operation from beginning to end. We set up tonight, Martin decided. Full surveillance. Margaret, we'll need you to adjust the work assignment so Brennan is on duty but positioned where we can observe him. Can you do that naturally without raising suspicion? I can put him on the tape backup rotation, Margaret said. That station has a clear sight line from the observation room, and it's isolated enough that he'll feel comfortable. Plus, the tape backup terminal has legitimate reasons to access large amounts of data, so if he's logging his activities, nothing will look unusual in the system reports. David was already thinking ahead. We'll need to involve legal, and probably law enforcement, though I'm not even sure what statute he's violating. Is this theft, industrial espionage, unauthorized access? Computer crime laws barely exist right now. Call the FBI, Raymond suggested. Everyone turned to look at him. He shrugged. I still have contacts from my police days. There's a new division that handles white-collar crime, technology-related offenses. They're small, and honestly, they're still figuring things out, but they'll know the right questions to ask and the right laws to cite. Plus, if this goes to trial, having federal agents involved will lend credibility. It was a good suggestion. Martin made a note to contact the company's legal department first thing in the morning, which was, he realized, with some surprise, in about 15 minutes. He'd been awake for over 24 hours, running on coffee and the peculiar clarity that comes from solving a puzzle that seemed insoluble. They left room 714 exactly as they'd found it. Door locked, evidence undisturbed. The modem sat in its crate, patiently waiting to perform its illicit function one more time. But tonight, when Thomas Brennan reached out across the telephone lines to steal data, he'd find something unexpected waiting for him. An audience. Martin and David and Margaret rode the elevator down in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. In the lobby, morning shift workers were already arriving, badges clipped to belts, coffee cups in hand, ready to begin another day of maintaining the electrical infrastructure that kept Northern California lit and powered. None of them knew that tonight, in the quiet hours after midnight, their data security would be tested in a way that would help define computer crime prosecution for years to come. Special Agent Patricia Lawson of the FBI's nascent Computer Crime Unit arrived at PG&E headquarters at 10 a.m. sharp, carrying a leather briefcase and an air of focused competence. She was younger than Martin had expected, perhaps 30,
with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that took in everything with the systematic attention of someone trained to notice details. "Gentlemen," she said, shaking hands with Martin and David in the conference room they'd commandeered for the day. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided over the phone. This is fascinating. We've seen maybe a dozen cases nationwide of computer-related theft, and most of those involved insiders simply walking out with printouts or magnetic tapes. Remote data extraction via modem? That's sophisticated." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad covered in neat handwriting. "Before we go any further, I need to understand exactly what data is being taken and what its value is. The prosecution will hinge on proving economic harm and criminal intent." David walked her through it. Customer records, billing information, consumption patterns, potentially hundreds of thousands of individual data points extracted over months of systematic theft. The information could be valuable to competitors, to marketing firms, to anyone interested in targeting PG&E customers with alternative services. In dollar terms, the data might be worth hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. "And you're certain it's Thomas Brennan?" Patricia asked. "As certain as we can be without catching him in the act," Martin replied. He spread out their evidence: the schedule correlation, the badge access records, the technical expertise required, and the pattern of Thursday night transfers. "Tonight we'll have proof." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure we document this properly. I'll need to be present for the surveillance, and I'll want to record everything, not just audio, but written logs of every action taken, every keystroke if possible. Defense attorneys love to attack chain of custody, and I don't want to give them any openings." They spent the afternoon preparing. Margaret rearranged the duty roster, ensuring that Brennan would be working the tape backup station with clear sight lines to the observation room. Gerald Thompson returned with additional recording equipment, a more sophisticated audio setup than the previous night's improvised arrangement, plus a video camera borrowed from a local news station that owed him a favor. "Video in low light won't be great," Gerald warned, as he set up the camera with its lens pressed against the observation room window. "But we should get enough to show who's sitting at that terminal and roughly what they're doing." At 11 p.m., the trap was set. Martin, David, Patricia, and Gerald settled into the observation room with the deliberate quiet of hunters waiting for their quarry. Raymond Torres positioned himself near the building's main entrance. If Brennan tried to leave during the operation, Raymond would delay him with some pretext until the evidence was secured. Margaret was at her supervisor's station in the computer room, the very picture of routine normalcy. The other night shift crew went about their duties, unaware that their colleague was under surveillance. Brennan arrived at his terminal at 11:47 p.m., carrying a coffee mug and a technical manual he set beside his keyboard. For the first hour, he worked exactly as he should, monitoring backup jobs, verifying tape rotations, responding to the occasional system alert. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Martin felt doubt creeping in. Had they been wrong? Had Brennan somehow learned of their investigation and modified his behavior? Or worse, had they built an elaborate theory around coincidental data that pointed to an innocent man? Then at 2:58 a.m., Brennan looked around the computer room. A casual glance, the kind anyone might make when checking if their supervisor was watching. Margaret was conspicuously focused on her paperwork, giving him the privacy he sought. Brennan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He opened it, consulted what appeared to be a list, and then began typing. Even through the window and from this distance, Martin could see the deliberate, methodical nature of his keystrokes. These weren't the fluid movements of someone working from memory. These were the careful inputs of someone following written instructions. "He's initiating the connection," David whispered. Gerald's audio equipment picked up the telltale modem sounds a moment later. The same warbling negotiation they'd heard the previous night. The same 300 baud handshake. Patricia was writing furiously on her legal pad, noting timestamps, observations, every detail that might matter in court. Through the observation window, they watched Brennan work. His terminal screen was too far away to read clearly, but they could see the steady stream of data scrolling past. File transfers, directory listings, commands being executed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Martin had one more trick prepared. Earlier in the day, working with the company's senior systems programmers, he had modified the mainframe's logging software to capture not just what files were accessed, but the exact sequence of commands used to access them. This audit trail would show precisely what Brennan was doing, creating a digital record that could be matched with the video and audio evidence. At 2:43 a.m., something changed. Brennan suddenly stopped typing. His posture shifted from relaxed to alert. He was staring at his terminal screen with an intensity that suggested he'd seen something unexpected. "What's wrong?" Patricia asked. "I don't know," Martin said, but he felt a cold wash of concern. Had their modified logging software triggered some kind of alert? Had Brennan detected their surveillance? For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, Brennan sat motionless. Then he reached forward and terminated the connection. No orderly logout sequence, no proper file closures, just an abrupt disconnection. He pulled a floppy disk from his jacket pocket, inserted it into the terminal's disk drive, and appeared to be copying something. "He's destroying evidence," David said. "Or securing it," Patricia corrected. "Either way, we need to move now before he leaves that terminal." She was already standing, moving toward the door. Martin grabbed the tape recorder, David had the camera, and Gerald was on the phone to Raymond, alerting him that their suspect was about to move. They entered the computer room at 2:47 a.m. Margaret looked up from her desk, her face carefully neutral. The other technicians barely registered their presence. IT managers wandering through at odd hours was unusual but not unheard of. Thomas Brennan saw them coming. For a fraction of a second, his face showed pure panic, his eyes widening, his skin paling. Then he recovered, his expression settling into studied confusion. "Martin, David, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Thomas Brennan," Patricia said, pulling out her FBI credentials. "I need you to step away from that terminal. Don't touch the keyboard. Don't remove any media. Don't log out. Just stand up slowly and step back." Brennan looked at the badge, at Patricia's face, then at the three men standing behind her. The calculation was visible in his eyes. Deny, deflect, cooperate. He chose the worst possible option. He lunged for the keyboard. David was faster. He grabbed Brennan's arm, preventing him from reaching the delete key. Raymond Torres appeared from the direction of the elevator, having sprinted up 7 flights of stairs, and within seconds, Thomas Brennan was in handcuffs, his career in ruins, his future uncertain. The modem was still active. On the terminal screen, frozen in mid-transfer, was a directory listing of customer billing records, thousands of names, addresses, and account numbers.
The interrogation room at the FBI's San Francisco field office was nothing like the dramatic spaces depicted in television police dramas. It was small, windowless, furnished with a metal table and 3 chairs, and painted in a shade of institutional beige that seemed designed to inspire truthfulness through sheer tedium. Thomas Brennan sat on one side of the table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. Patricia Lawson sat across from him, a case file open before her, while Martin Kellerman and a federal prosecutor named James Chen observed through a one-way mirror. It was late Friday afternoon, nearly 40 hours after Brennan's arrest. He'd spent most of that time in a holding cell, consulting with a court-appointed attorney who'd advised him to cooperate fully. The evidence was overwhelming, the attorney had explained. Fighting was pointless. The best outcome now was a reduced sentence in exchange for information about where the stolen data had gone and who'd paid him to take it. "Let's start with the basics," Patricia said, her voice calm and professional. "How long have you been extracting data from PG&E's systems?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, and then he sighed, a sound of resignation, of a man who'd been carrying a burden for too long, and was almost relieved to set it down. 7 months. Since August of last year. And who hired you to do this? A company called Pacific Marketing Associates. They approached me at a trade show, said they were interested in demographic data for targeted advertising campaigns. They offered me $5,000 a month, cash, for customer lists and consumption patterns. Patricia made notes. Pacific Marketing Associates. They'd already started investigating the company and had found it was a shell entity, registered in Delaware, with no physical offices and a bank account that had quietly funneled money to various offshore locations. Following that trail would take months and would likely lead to dead ends, but it had to be done. "Let's start with the basics," Patricia said, her voice calm and professional. "How long have you been extracting data from PG&E's systems?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, and then he sighed, a sound of resignation, of a man who'd been carrying a burden for too long and was almost relieved to set it down. 7 months. Since August of last year. And who hired you to do this? A company called Pacific Marketing Associates. They approached me at a trade show, said they were interested in demographic data for targeted advertising campaigns. They offered me $5,000 a month, cash, for customer lists and consumption patterns. Patricia made notes. Pacific Marketing Associates. They'd already started investigating the company and had found it was a shell entity, registered in Delaware, with no physical offices
and a bank account that had quietly funneled money to various offshore locations. Following that trail would take months and would likely lead to dead ends, but it had to be done. "Walk me through the technical process," Patricia said. "How did you set up the unauthorized access?" And Brennan did, in remarkable detail. It was the confession of a craftsman, a man who'd taken pride in the elegance of his crime, as he'd known it was wrong. He'd installed the rogue modem himself, running the phone line through existing conduits, so it appeared to be part of the building's original telecommunications infrastructure. He'd created a backdoor account on the mainframe, a ghost user with administrative privileges that existed in the system but appeared nowhere in official records. The modem itself was the key to his methodology. The Hayes Smart Modem 300 was slow by 1984 standards, but it was also quiet and reliable. Faster modems created more line noise, generated more traffic in the phone company's switching systems, and were more likely to trigger anomaly detection. At 300 baud, his data transfers looked like routine maintenance traffic, too small and slow to merit attention. "But you made a mistake," Patricia said. "You followed a pattern. Every Thursday night, occasionally Tuesdays, always between 2 and 3:30 a.m. That regularity is what gave you away." Brennan nodded slowly. "I had to balance stealth with efficiency. If I'd varied the schedule more randomly, I might have accidentally chosen times when security was conducting audits, or when system loads were too high. Thursday night was safe. It was after midweek system backups, but before Friday's batch processing. The window was reliable." "And Tuesday?" Martin asked, from behind the mirror, though Brennan couldn't hear him. As if anticipating the question, Patricia asked, "Why occasionally Tuesdays?" "Catch-up," Brennan admitted. "If Thursday's transfer was incomplete, or if I had a particularly large data request from my clients, I'd make a supplementary connection on Tuesday. In retrospect, I should have stuck to a single day. The variation was probably what made the pattern visible in the first place." They talked for another 2 hours, working through technical details that would be crucial for the prosecution. The legal framework for computer crime was still being developed. There was no established precedent for this kind of case, no clear statutory definition of unauthorized access or data theft in the digital realm. The prosecution would need to prove both the technical feasibility of the crime and the intent to cause economic harm. But it was Gerald Thompson's work that would ultimately seal the conviction. The telecommunications engineer had spent the past 2 days performing what he called acoustic forensic analysis of the recorded modem connections. He'd discovered something remarkable. Every modem, like every human voice, had a unique acoustic signature. The specific harmonics, the timing of tone transitions, the subtle fluctuations in carrier frequency. These elements combined to create a fingerprint as distinct as the whorls on a human thumb. Gerald had recorded dozens of legitimate modem connections from various computers in the PG&E building. He'd also captured the audio of Brennan's illicit connections. Using signal analysis software, custom written for this investigation, he had demonstrated that the unauthorized modem's acoustic signature matched none of the legitimate connections, but did match the general characteristics of a Hayes Smart Modem 300. More damning, he had examined the specific physical modem found in room 714, connected it to a test system, and recorded its operation. The acoustic signature was an exact match to the illicit transfers. Not similar, exact. The same subtle harmonic distortions, the same timing pattern, the same electronic fingerprint. This modem, Gerald testified at a preliminary hearing the following week, created the sounds we recorded during the unauthorized data transfers. There is no possibility of coincidence. It's like matching a bullet to a specific gun barrel. The evidence is conclusive. The defense attorney, doing his best with an unwinnable case, tried to argue that modem sounds could be replicated, that the analysis was junk science, that acoustic forensics had never been used in a computer crime case before. But the technical demonstrations were too compelling, the pattern too clear. Martin Kellerman had used that specific modem to steal data, and the sounds it made had betrayed him as surely as a fingerprint left on a window or a footprint in mud. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It made headlines in technical journals and a few forward-thinking newspapers that understood the significance of what was happening. "Computer thief caught by modem sounds," read one headline. "FBI cracks data theft case with acoustic analysis," read another. The coverage was small, buried in business sections, but people in the growing computer industry noticed. Thomas Brennan was convicted on 14 counts of unauthorized access, wire fraud, and industrial espionage. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to PG&E for the estimated value of the stolen data, a sum that the court determined to be $347,000 based on what competitors might have paid for equivalent customer intelligence. Pacific Marketing Associates dissolved before investigators could identify its true owners. The money trail led to the Cayman Islands and stopped there, another anonymous corporate shell among thousands. Whoever had hired Brennan to steal the data got away clean. But the case itself became a landmark. It was one of the first successful prosecutions of computer-related crime in the United States, and the acoustic forensic techniques Gerald developed became standard practice for telecommunications fraud investigations. Law schools began citing United States versus Brennan in their emerging classes on computer crime. Security consultants used it as a cautionary tale to convince skeptical executives that data theft was a real threat that required real protective measures. Martin Kellerman was promoted to Director of Information Security, a newly created position. His first act was to implement comprehensive access logging, automated anomaly detection, and regular security audits. The unauthorized modem was placed in a locked display case in the data center, a reminder of the price of complacency. David Chen left PG&E 6 months after the trial, taking a position with a startup that was developing new security protocols for networked computers. He'd seen the future during those sleepless nights of investigation, and he wanted to help build defenses against the attacks that would inevitably come as the digital age matured. And Gerald Thompson published a paper on acoustic modem forensics that became required reading in telecommunications engineering programs. He included detailed spectral analyses, pattern recognition algorithms, and case study data from the Brennan investigation. The paper ended with a prescient warning. As data becomes more valuable and networks become more complex, the methods used to steal information will grow more sophisticated. We must stay vigilant, because in the digital realm, even sounds can be evidence of crime. On a quiet Thursday night in November 1984, 8 months after Thomas Brennan's arrest, Martin stood alone in the PG&E data center, listening to the familiar hum of mainframes and cooling fans. The new security systems were in place, the audit logs were clean, and the company's data was as safe as human ingenuity could make it. But Martin knew something that kept him awake sometimes, a truth that would only become more relevant as the years passed. Security was never permanent, never complete. It was a process, not a destination, an endless cycle of protection, detection, and response. Somewhere out there, someone else was already planning the next theft, developing the next attack, looking for the next vulnerability. The data ghost was caught, but there would be others. The lights hummed, the computers processed, and the data flowed on, carrying with it the eternal tension between those who would protect and those who would steal, between security and vulnerability, between the watchers and the watched. In the end, it had been sounds that caught Thomas Brennan, the distinctive electronic warble of a modem singing its criminal song into the darkness. In an age before encryption, before firewalls, before the sophisticated digital defenses that would one day become commonplace, it was the analog world that had betrayed him. The old phone lines, the acoustic signatures, the patient work of engineers who understood that every connection left traces. Martin checked the security logs one final time, then headed for the elevator. Behind him, the data center continued its eternal vigil, machines processing the endless flow of information that powered a modern utility. The ghost was gone, but its echo remained, a reminder that in the intersection of technology and crime, sometimes the oldest tools were the most effective. The modem in its display case caught the light as Martin passed, a relic already, though barely 8 months had passed since its discovery. Technology moved quickly. Crime moved with it. But sound remained constant. And in those acoustic patterns, in the physics of waves and frequencies, lay a truth that would transcend the digital age. Everything leaves a trace. Every action has consequences. Every crime, no matter how carefully planned, creates ripples that the patient investigator can follow back to their source. The elevator doors closed, the data center hummed on. And somewhere in the city, in offices and homes and labs, the next generation of computer users logged into their systems, unaware that they were pioneers in a new frontier where crime and justice would be redefined by the very technology they were creating. The 1980s data ghost was caught. The case was closed. But the age of digital crime had only just begun.